Welcome to Snooze and Stories. Tonight, we are going to travel a very long way, not across an ocean and not through a forest, but through time itself. We are going to step back more than 500 years to a land of rolling green hills and silver olive trees, of church bells drifting over terracotta rooftops, of rivers that wind slowly through valleys painted gold by the afternoon sun. We are going to the Italy of the Renaissance, and we are going to follow the life of one man, a man so curious, so endlessly reaching toward the horizon of human knowledge, that even today, 5 centuries after his death, we are still finding new things to learn from him. A man who painted smiles that have never been fully explained. A man who sketched flying machines 200 years before the first airplane. A man who looked at the human body and at the night sky and at the ripple of water with the same quiet, astonished reverence. His name was Leonardo da Vinci. Before we begin, if you enjoy these historical stories, please subscribe right now and help this channel to grow. Every subscriber genuinely makes a difference for a new channel like this, and the like button pushes this video to more people who want to hear stories like these. Your support means everything. And if you have suggestions for other historical figures whose stories you'd like to hear, leave a comment below. Now, let us settle in. There is something particular about Leonardo that makes him a perfect companion for the quiet hours before sleep. He was, above almost everything else, an observer. He spent his life watching light fall across a cheekbone, watching water move around a stone, watching a bird rise on a thermal current, and wondering, truly wondering, what it would feel like to do the same. He moved through the world with a kind of patient, open attention that most of us only manage in our calmest, most unhurried moments. And so tonight, as your own breathing slows and the edges of the day begin to soften and blur, we will move through his life the way he might have moved through a landscape, slowly, noticing things, pausing where something is beautiful or strange or worth sitting with for a while. This is not a story of battles or conquests, though there are powerful men in it. It is not a story of easy triumph, though there are masterpieces. It is, more than anything, the story of a mind that was never quite satisfied, never quite finished, always looking for the next question hidden inside the last answer, a mind that found wonder in everything it touched. And perhaps, as you listen tonight, some of that wonder will find its way into your own thoughts. Perhaps you will drift towards sleep carrying something of Leonardo's world with you. The smell of linseed oil and pigment, the scratch of a quill across paper, the light of a Florentine morning coming in through a high window, falling on a canvas that is only just beginning. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop, and let us begin. To understand Leonardo, you must first understand the land that made him. Tuscany, in the middle of the 15th century, was a place of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary contrast. The cities were growing loud and ambitious, filled with merchants and bankers and artists and philosophers, all jostling against one another in the narrow streets, all competing for patronage and prestige and the favor of powerful men. But just beyond the city walls, just a few hours' walk into the hills, the world became something else entirely. It became quiet. It became green. It became ancient in a way that no amount of human ambition could disturb. The town of Vinci sits on the southern slope of Monte Albano in the valley of the Arno River, roughly 30 kilometers west of Florence. Even today, it is a small place, a cluster of stone buildings on a hillside surrounded by vineyards and olive groves and the kind of soft, layered landscape that seems to exist in a permanent state of gentle afternoon. In the 15th century, it was smaller still, A village, really. A place where everyone knew everyone else, where the seasons set the rhythm of life, and where the great dramas of Florence and Rome and Milan felt very far away indeed. It was here, on the 15th of April, in the year 1452, that Leonardo was born. The circumstances of his birth were, by the standards of the time, complicated, though perhaps not as unusual as we might imagine today. His father was Ser Piero da Vinci, a young notary from a family that had produced notaries for several generations. Notaries in Renaissance Italy were important men. They drew up legal contracts, witnessed property transfers, and handled the paperwork of commerce and inheritance that kept society running. Ser Piero was ambitious, well-connected, and on his way to a comfortable and respectable life in Florence. He was also, at the time of Leonardo's conception, not married to Leonardo's mother. Her name was Caterina. Beyond that, history grows quieter. She was likely a young woman of modest background, perhaps a peasant or servant in the area around Vinci, and the exact nature of her relationship with Ser Piero has never been fully established. What we know is this. She and Ser Piero were not married to each other, and when Leonardo was born, he entered the world with the legal status of an illegitimate child. In 15th century Italy, this was not the disaster it might have been in other times and places. Illegitimate children were common enough among the middle and upper classes, and the social stigma, while real, was manageable, particularly for a boy with a father willing to acknowledge him. Ser Piero did acknowledge Leonardo. He did not, however, take him to Florence. Instead, the infant Leonardo was brought into the household of his paternal grandfather, a man named Antonio da Vinci, and his wife Lucia. It was in their home, in the hills above Vinci, that Leonardo would spend the first years of his life. Caterina, for her part, married another man, a local farmer and lime burner named Antonio di Piero Butti, known in the village as Accattabriga, which meant something like the quarrelsome one. She went on to have several children with him. Leonardo and his mother would remain in contact throughout his life, but the bond between them, shaped by separation in his earliest years, remains one of the quiet mysteries of his biography. And so the boy grew up in his grandfather's house on a hillside in Tuscany, surrounded by the sounds and smells and textures of the natural world. Imagine it with me for a moment. The morning light coming over the ridge of Monte Albano, turning the mist in the valley below to something almost luminous. The rows of olive trees with their silver-green leaves trembling in the slightest breeze. The sound of water in the irrigation channels that ran between the fields. The smell of the earth after rain. The cicadas in summer, so loud they seemed to fill the sky. The way the clouds moved over the hills, casting slow shadows across the vineyards, shadows that shifted and changed and were never the same twice. This was Leonardo's classroom before he ever sat down to any formal lesson, and it was, in many ways, the most important classroom he would ever have. His grandfather, Antonio, appears in the historical record as a gentle, unhurried man, someone who kept careful notes about the weather and the crops, who paid attention to the small details of the world around him. It is tempting, and perhaps not unreasonable, to see in him an early model for the grandson who would one day fill thousands of pages with his own careful observations. The habit of noticing, really noticing with full attention, may have been something Leonardo first learned simply by watching an old man watch the sky. His uncle, Francesco, was perhaps an even more direct influence. Francesco da Vinci was younger than his brother Ser Piero, and, unlike him, had no professional ambitions to pursue in the city. He stayed in Vinci, managing the family's land, and he appears to have been genuinely fond of his nephew. He and Leonardo spent time together in the fields and orchards, and later in life, Leonardo would leave a small bequest to Francesco in his will, a quiet gesture of remembered affection. But what of the boy himself? What do we actually know about the child Leonardo? The documentary record of his earliest years is thin, as it is for almost everyone born in a small Italian town in the 15th century.
We have a birth record, a note made by his grandfather Antonio in the family's book of records, casual and warm in its tone, noting the birth of a grandson, the son of Ser Piero, my son, on the 15th day of April. We have a few tax records, a handful of later reminiscences, and we have, most valuably of all, Leonardo's own later writings, scattered references, half-memories, images that surface in his notebooks like objects rising slowly through deep water. One of those images is a dream, or perhaps a memory, Leonardo himself was not certain, that he recorded in his notebooks many years later. He described a kite, a bird of prey with a long forked tail, swooping down to his cradle and brushing its tail feathers against his lips again and again. Whether this was a real event, a dream, or an image his imagination had constructed around some kernel of truth, we cannot say. But Leonardo returned to it, wrote about it, turned it over in his mind. And the kite, the flight of birds, the mechanics of wings, the dream of rising into the open air would remain with him for the rest of his life. There is something in this image that feels very true to what we know of Leonardo's inner world. The sense of wonder without fear, the open, receptive quality of attention, the way the natural world seemed to reach toward him, or perhaps the way he reached toward it, so completely, so willingly, that the boundary between observer and observed sometimes seemed to dissolve.
He was, by all later accounts, an unusually beautiful child, and an unusually gifted one. He had a quality that people noticed and remembered, something in his presence, in the way he moved and spoke and looked at things. Giorgio Vasari, the 16th century artist and biographer who would write about Leonardo's life several decades after his death, describes him in almost mythological terms, a child of such grace and beauty that he seemed to belong to another order of being entirely. We should take Vasari's enthusiasms with a certain measure of caution. He had a gift for the dramatic, but the consistency with which people throughout Leonardo's life remarked on his personal magnetism suggests there was something real beneath the legend. He learned quickly, and he learned hungrily. He had an aptitude for mathematics that surprised his teachers. He had a singing voice that was, by all accounts, beautiful. He could play the lyre. He could tell stories. He was left-handed, a detail that would later influence the distinctive mirror writing that fills his notebooks, and the world of objects seemed to yield its secrets to his hands in ways that left adults shaking their heads in quiet astonishment. But formal schooling, in the academic sense, was limited. Leonardo did not attend a university. He did not study Latin with the rigor that the scholarly professions demanded, a fact that he was sometimes sensitive about in later life, occasionally referring to himself, with a mixture of irony and defiance, as an unlettered man. What he had instead was something that no university could have given him: years of unhurried, unstructured, endlessly curious attention to the world as it actually was, rather than as books said it should be. He would have been, by his early teenage years, a young man standing at a threshold. His father, Ser Piero, had by now established himself in Florence, where he was building a successful career as a notary. He had married, not Caterina, but a respectable woman named Albiera di Giovanni Amadori, and had set himself up in the world. He was, in the way of ambitious men, thinking about the future, and he was thinking, among other things, about his eldest son. Leonardo's illegitimate birth meant that he could not follow his father into the notarial profession. The guild had strict rules about legitimacy. He could not easily enter the church or the law or most of the established professional paths that a boy of his background might otherwise have hoped for. But there was one world in Florence that was more open, more fluid, more willing to judge a young man by what his hands could do rather than by the precise circumstances of his birth. That world was the world of the artist. And so, sometime around 1466, when Leonardo was perhaps 14 years old, Ser Piero da Vinci brought his son to Florence, to the workshop of one of the most celebrated artists in the city. The hills of Vinci were behind him now, the olive trees and the morning mist and the long, unhurried afternoons of his childhood, all of it receding into memory, becoming the deep foundation on which everything else would be built. Ahead of him, the city, the noise, the smell of paint and hot metal, and a new world waiting to be learned.
Florence, in the second half of the 15th century, was the closest thing the Western world had to a city at the center of the universe. That is not an exaggeration, or at least it would not have felt like one to the people who lived there. Florence was the city of the Medici, the great banking family whose wealth and taste and political cunning had transformed a prosperous merchant town into the beating heart of a cultural revolution. It was the city of Brunelleschi, who had solved the seemingly impossible problem of the cathedral dome, and in doing so, changed the way architects thought about space and structure forever. It was the city of Donatello, whose sculptures seemed to breathe, of Botticelli, whose paintings seemed to dream, of philosophers who read Plato by candlelight and believed with genuine fervor that they were living through a rebirth of the ancient world, a renaissance in the most literal sense of the word. Into this city came Leonardo da Vinci, a teenager from the hills, with paint-stained fingers and eyes that missed nothing. The workshop he entered belonged to Andrea del Verrocchio, and it was one of the most remarkable creative enterprises in Florence, which is to say, in the world. Verrocchio was a man of extraordinary range. He was a painter, yes, but also a sculptor, a goldsmith, a designer of theatrical pageants, a maker of musical instruments, a restorer of ancient objects, a creator of elaborate ceremonial armor. His bottega, the Italian word for workshop, though it was much more than a workshop in the modern sense, was a place where the distinctions between art and craft, between beauty and function, between the making of a painting and the casting of a bronze statue dissolved into a single roaring current of creative energy. A Renaissance bottega was not a quiet studio where a solitary genius communed with his muse. It was a busy, noisy, productive place, more like a small factory than anything we might today call an atelier. The master took commissions from wealthy patrons and from the church, and his apprentices and assistants worked alongside him on everything from major altarpieces to decorative furniture to the design of festival floats. The young men who came to learn a trade there learned it not from lectures or textbooks, but from doing, from grinding pigments and preparing panels and mixing varnishes, and eventually from picking up a brush and contributing their own small portions to works that would go out into the world bearing the master's name. Leonardo arrived in this world at perhaps 14 or 15 years of age. The precise date of his entry into Verrocchio's shop is not recorded, but it was most likely around 1466, and he took to it with the quiet, concentrated intensity that would characterize everything he did for the rest of his life. Ser Piero da Vinci had, according to the story as Vasari tells it, brought a selection of his son's drawings to Verrocchio before any formal arrangement was made. The master looked at them, and whatever he saw in those drawings, the steadiness of the hand, the precision of the eye, the quality of attention, was enough. Leonardo was taken on. It is worth pausing here to consider what this moment must have meant for the boy from Vinci. Florence was overwhelming in a way that is difficult to fully imagine from the distance of 5.5 centuries. The scale of the buildings, the density of the streets, the noise and smell of a city of perhaps 50 or 60,000 people, the shouts of vendors, the clatter of carts on stone, the constant ringing of church bells, the smell of the river on warm days, and beneath all of it, the particular atmosphere of a place that believed with enormous confidence that it was changing the world.
And the art. Everywhere, the art. On the facades of churches, in the niches of public buildings, in the great halls of palaces that opened onto shadowed courtyards, in the workshops that lined the streets of the city's central districts. A young man with eyes like Leonardo's, eyes that wanted to see everything, to understand everything, must have walked through Florence in a state of almost continuous astonishment. Verrocchio's workshop was in the heart of this world, and it attracted the best young talent in the city. Among Leonardo's fellow apprentices during these years was a boy named Pietro Perugino, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated painters of his generation, and who would, in turn, teach a young man named Raphael. The circles of influence in Renaissance Florence were tight and deep and productive in ways that still echo through the history of Western art. What did Leonardo learn in those early years? He learned the technical foundations of the painter's craft with a thoroughness that would serve him for the rest of his life, and that he would, in time, push far beyond the limits of what his teachers knew. He learned to prepare wooden panels with gesso, the smooth white ground on which paint would be laid. He learned to mix pigments, the expensive ultramarine blue made from ground lapis lazuli, the warm earth tones derived from minerals, the whites and yellows and greens that a painter needed to render the full range of the visible world. He learned the art of tempera painting, in which pigments were mixed with egg yolk, and later the newer technique of oil painting, which had been developed in the north and was just beginning to make its way into Italian workshops, bringing with it an entirely new range of possibilities for the rendering of light and shadow and depth. He learned to draw. This might seem obvious, surely a painter learns to draw, but the kind of drawing Leonardo learned and then transcended was something far beyond the mere outlining of forms. Drawing in the Renaissance workshop was the foundation of everything. It was the way an artist thought through a problem, worked out a composition, captured the memory of something seen, and stored it for later use. Leonardo's drawings from these early years already show a quality of observation that goes beyond anything his contemporaries were doing, a hunger to understand not just what things looked like, but how they worked, how they were put together, what lay beneath the surface. He drew hands obsessively. He drew faces from every angle, studying the way light fell differently on a cheekbone turned slightly away from the source, the way the shadow beneath a chin changed with the height of the light. He drew draped fabric with a patience and precision that transformed cloth into something almost geological, something with its own weight, its own internal structure, its own story. And he watched Verrocchio. He watched him work in bronze and marble as well as paint. He watched the way the master moved between different materials and different problems without losing the thread of his intention. He understood, watching Verrocchio, that the division of the arts into separate categories, painting here, sculpture there, architecture somewhere else entirely, was a convenience of classification, not a truth about how the creative mind actually worked. The workshop produced important commissions during these years, and Leonardo's hand can be traced in some of them, sometimes clearly, sometimes only in the quality of certain passages that seem to lift out of their surroundings like a different frequency of light. The most famous story of these apprentice years concerns a painting called The Baptism of Christ, which Verrocchio undertook sometime in the early 1470s. It was a conventional subject, Jesus standing in the River Jordan, John the Baptist pouring water over his head, two angels kneeling at the left to witness the moment. Verrocchio painted most of it himself, but he gave Leonardo the task of painting one of the two angels, the one on the far left, seen in three-quarter profile, its gaze directed inward and upward with an expression of such quiet, absorbed reverence that it seems to exist in a different emotional register from everything around it. The story, as Vasari tells it, is that when Verrocchio saw what his young apprentice had done, he was so overcome by the realization that the boy had surpassed him that he put down his brush and vowed never to paint again, because, Vasari says, it shamed him that a mere child should know more of the art than he did. Like many of Vasari's best stories, this one is probably more legend than history. Verrocchio did continue to produce work after the baptism, and the relationship between master and apprentice appears to have remained warm and productive for years afterward. But the story contains a truth, even if it is not a fact. The angel Leonardo painted in that picture is genuinely something apart. The softness of the face, the way the light seems to come from within the skin rather than falling on it from outside, the tender particularity of the expression, it announces the arrival of a sensibility that the world had not quite seen before. Leonardo was registered as a member of the Painters Guild, the Compagnia di San Luca, in 1472, at the age of 20. This was the formal mark of his professional standing, his entry into the adult world of the Florentine art market. But he continued to work in Verrocchio's shop for several more years, taking on his own commissions while remaining within the orbit of the workshop that had shaped him. He was, by all accounts, a remarkable presence in the city. People noticed him in the way they always would, the physical grace, the quality of attention he brought to everything, the sense that beneath the pleasant surface of his conversation, something much larger and more complex was constantly in motion. He had friends and appears to have been genuinely sociable, capable of great charm and warmth. But there was always, even in these early years, something slightly separate about him. Something that lived at a slight angle to the ordinary concerns of the world around him. He was accumulating in these years more than technical skill. He was accumulating a way of seeing, a way of moving through the world with his eyes fully open, his mind always asking why and how and what if. He was beginning to fill his first notebooks, those extraordinary documents that would, over the course of his lifetime, run to thousands of pages and encompass everything from the flight of birds to the nature of the soul. Florence had given him his craft. Verrocchio had given him his foundations, but the questions that were beginning to form in his mind, the deep, restless, inexhaustible questions, those were entirely his own. And Florence, extraordinary as it was already beginning to feel, to that quietly reaching mind, like just the beginning. There is a particular kind of threshold that every artist crosses, or tries to cross, at some point in their early career. It is the moment when the work stops being an exercise and starts being a statement. When the hand that has spent years learning to obey begins, quietly and with growing confidence, to lead. For Leonardo, that threshold came gradually, as thresholds often do. There was no single morning when he woke up and knew himself to be a master. There was instead a slow accumulation of skill, of confidence, of a vision so particular and so insistent that it could no longer be contained within the conventions he had inherited. It seeped out around the edges of everything he touched, and anyone who looked closely enough could see it. And people did look closely. Florence in the 1470s was a city that paid attention to its artists the way later centuries would pay attention to their scientists or their rock stars. The names of the great painters and sculptors were known in the streets, debated in the workshops, celebrated in the poems and letters of the educated class. When a young man of genuine talent appeared, the city noticed. Florence noticed Leonardo. Among his earliest surviving independent works is a painting known as The Annunciation, most likely completed sometime in the early to mid-1470s, when Leonardo was in his early 20s. The subject was one of the most familiar in all of Christian art, the moment when the angel Gabriel appears to the young Mary to tell her that she will conceive and bear the Son of God. Every painter of any ambition had painted it. Every church in Italy seemed to have at least one version on its walls. The iconography was so thoroughly established that there was almost no room left for surprise. And yet, Leonardo found room. The painting, which now hangs in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, shows the angel kneeling in a garden to the left, one hand raised in greeting, wings spread with the careful naturalism of a man who has studied actual birds rather than relying on the decorative conventions of earlier painters. To the right, Mary sits at a lectern, her hand raised in a gesture that captures something wonderfully ambiguous. Surprise, yes, but also a kind of composed inward acceptance, as though some part of her already knew. Behind both figures, a landscape recedes into a soft, luminous distance, the hills and water and sky dissolving into one another with a delicacy that would become one of Leonardo's most distinctive signatures. Look at the angel's wings. In most Annunciation paintings of the period, wings are decorative objects, symmetrical, feathery, gold-tipped, more emblem than anatomy. Leonardo's wings are different. They are the wings of a large bird, studied from life, structured according to the actual mechanics of how a wing attaches to a body and how it spreads to carry weight through air.
They are not symbols of the divine. They are solutions to the problem of flight. Beautiful solutions, yes, but rooted in observation rather than convention. This was already, in a painter barely out of his apprenticeship, a revolutionary instinct. It was also during these early years that Leonardo's contribution to Verrocchio's baptism of Christ became fully apparent, or rather, became fully impossible to ignore.
The painting, as we noted in the last chapter, was largely Verrocchio's work, but the angel Leonardo painted and the landscape in the upper left portion of the canvas, that soft, almost watercolor distance of mountains and sky, were unmistakably different in character from everything around them. Where Verrocchio's figures were solid and clearly defined, their outlines firm, their forms modeled with the confidence of a sculptor thinking in paint, Leonardo's angel had a different kind of presence, softer, more interior, more alive somehow to the specific quality of the light and the specific atmosphere of the moment. It was the difference between depicting a thing and inhabiting it. Verrocchio was a great artist and an intelligent man, and he understood what he was seeing. The legend of him putting down his brush forever may be embellished, but the spirit of it is almost certainly true. He recognized in his young apprentice a quality that went beyond what he himself possessed, and he was generous enough to acknowledge it. Recognition in the Renaissance art world came in the form of commissions. A painter who could be trusted to produce good work on schedule and within the conventions expected by a patron was a painter who would eat regularly and sleep under a decent roof. A painter whose work was genuinely extraordinary could aspire to something more, to the patronage of the great families, to prestigious public commissions, to a kind of fame that transcended the merely professional. Leonardo's first major independent commission came from the monks of San Donato a Scopeto, a monastery just outside the walls of Florence. They wanted an altarpiece, a large, ambitious painting depicting the adoration of the Magi, the moment when the three wise men arrived from the east to pay homage to the infant Jesus. It was 1481. Leonardo was 29 years old, and this was his opportunity to announce himself to the city on his own terms. He approached the commission with the full force of his imagination. His preparatory drawings, many of which survive, show the extraordinary complexity of the composition he was planning. A central group of Mary and the infant, surrounded by a swirling crowd of figures, each one distinct, each one caught in their own particular moment of response to the divine child. Old men and young men, figures kneeling, rising, gesturing, turning away. Horses in the background, their bodies rendered with the same anatomical precision he brought to everything. A ruined arcade, its arches opening onto a landscape that recedes in the new mathematical manner of perspective that Brunelleschi and Alberti had given to Florentine art. The underdrawing, the preliminary sketch laid down on the panel before any paint was applied, is itself a masterpiece. It exists today in a state of extraordinary preservation precisely because the painting itself was never finished. Leonardo abandoned it. This was not the last time he would do this, and it is worth pausing on the pattern because it tells us something important about how his mind worked. The adoration of the Magi was not abandoned because Leonardo lost interest in the subject, or because the commission fell through, or because he ran out of time. It was abandoned, or more precisely, it was suspended indefinitely in a state of becoming, because the process of making it had satisfied some deep need in him, and the completion of it offered nothing that the making of it had not already given. For most artists, the finished work is the point. The sketches and studies are the means. The painting is the end. For Leonardo, this relationship was at some fundamental level reversed. The investigation was the point. The questions that arose in the process of trying to render something. How does light actually fall on a face turned at this angle? How does a crowd of people actually organize itself around a focal point? What does the body of a horse look like when it is caught in the precise instant between one movement and the next? These were the things that truly engaged him. The finished painting, once those questions had been at least partially answered, was in some sense already behind him. This is not laziness. It is almost the opposite of laziness. The surviving underdrawing of the adoration reveals a mind working at a pitch of concentration and ambition that most finished paintings never approach. But it does reveal something about the gap that would always exist in Leonardo's inner life between the limitless space of investigation and the necessarily limited space of a completed object. His patrons, understandably, did not always appreciate this distinction. There was another unfinished work from these early years, smaller in scale but in some ways equally revealing. The monks of San Rocco had commissioned a painting of Saint Jerome in the wilderness, the great scholar and translator of the Bible, depicted in the traditional manner, old and gaunt, kneeling in the desert, a stone in his hand with which to beat his breast in penitence. Leonardo began it, and then he did not finish it. What survives is a panel painting in a state of near completion, or rather of suspended preparation, in which the figure of Jerome is rendered with an anatomical precision that is almost shocking in its intensity. The old man's neck, in particular, is a study in muscularity that goes far beyond what any painter strictly needed to know in order to depict a saint in the wilderness. You can see in that neck the evidence of dissection, or at least of an obsessive, systematic study of the human body that went to the level of what lies beneath the skin. Leonardo had been looking already at what was not visible, at the structure beneath the surface, at the mechanism beneath the appearance. It was a habit that would deepen into one of the great scientific projects of his life. But even here, in his 20s, in a painting begun as a routine religious commission, it was already visible. By the early 1480s, Leonardo was a recognized figure in Florentine artistic life, a man whose talent was acknowledged, whose company was sought, whose presence in a room had the quality that people would, in later and less decorous times, call charisma. He had friends in the literary and philosophical circles that gathered around the Medici court. He had admirers and patrons, and almost certainly rivals. He was also, in ways that he may have been only beginning to fully understand, restless. Florence had given him everything a young artist could ask for. It had given him training and community and commissions and the stimulus of one of the greatest concentrations of creative talent in human history. But it had not given him, could not give him, the particular kind of freedom his mind was beginning to require. The freedom to pursue a question past the point where it was useful. The freedom to be a painter and a scientist and an engineer and a musician and a philosopher all at once, without having to choose, without having to finish. Somewhere in the north of Italy, in a city of canals and courtyards and military ambitions, a duke was looking for a man who could do all of those things, and Leonardo was about to find him.
There is a letter that survives, from around the year 1482, written in Leonardo's own hand, or rather dictated in his mind, for it exists in draft form among his papers, addressed to Ludovico Sforza, the powerful ruler of Milan. It is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of self-promotion, and it tells us a great deal about how Leonardo understood himself at the age of 30, standing on the threshold of the next great chapter of his life. The letter is essentially a job application, and it is remarkable for what it emphasizes and for what it mentions almost as an afterthought. Leonardo begins not with painting, but with engineering. He describes in careful and confident detail his ability to design portable bridges for military use. He writes about methods for draining moats and destroying enemy fortifications. He describes armored vehicles, precursors in their basic conception to the tank. He discusses the design of cannon and mortars, of ships capable of withstanding enemy fire, of tunnels that could be dug beneath defensive walls. He goes on to describe his abilities in architecture, in the design of public and private buildings, in the creation of waterways and canals. He mentions sculpture. He mentions his ability to create works in marble, bronze, and clay. And then, almost at the end, almost as a footnote, he adds, he can also paint, if anyone is interested. It is, depending on how you read it,
either the most confident thing ever written by a man who knew his own worth, or a masterpiece of strategic positioning by someone who understood exactly what a military duke needed to hear. Probably it was both. Leonardo was many things, and among them, he was a man who paid attention to the world he was actually living in, and the world he was moving toward was one in which a ruler's survival depended far more on the quality of his fortifications than on the beauty of his altarpieces. Milan, in 1482, was a very different city from Florence. Where Florence was a republic, messy, argumentative, governed by the shifting alliances of merchant families and guilds, Milan was a duchy, ruled with the firm hand of the Sforza family, who had seized power a generation earlier and were now in the business of consolidating and expanding it. The city was larger than Florence, wealthier in some respects, more strategically important. It sat at the heart of the Po Valley, controlling trade routes that connected Italy to the rest of Europe, and it was surrounded by rivals, Venice to the east, France pressing from the northwest, the shifting alliances of the Italian peninsula creating a political landscape that required constant vigilance and frequent military expenditure. Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, the Dark One, a reference to his complexion and perhaps also to the opacity of his political maneuverings, was not yet the official duke when Leonardo arrived. He was the regent, ruling on behalf of his young nephew, Gian Galeazzo, whom he would eventually push aside entirely. He was intelligent, calculating, genuinely interested in culture and learning, and keenly aware that a brilliant court reflected well on its patron. He had already attracted scholars and poets and musicians to Milan. A painter and engineer of Leonardo's rumored talents was exactly the kind of acquisition that would enhance his reputation. Whether Ludovico was immediately overwhelmed by Leonardo's gifts, or whether the relationship developed more gradually, is not entirely clear from the historical record. What is clear is that Leonardo did go to Milan, did enter the service of the Sforza court, and did remain there for approximately 17 years, the longest continuous period he would spend anywhere in his adult life. Milan became, in a very real sense, the city of his maturity.
The Sforza court was a world unlike anything Leonardo had known in Florence or Vinci. It was grander, more ceremonial, more explicitly theatrical. Ludovico loved spectacle, elaborate festivals, allegorical pageants, theatrical performances in which the scenery and the costumes and the mechanical effects were as important as the words. Leonardo, who had a theatrical instinct that went largely unrecognized in his later reputation as a solitary genius, took to this with evident delight. He designed stage sets and costumes. He invented mechanical devices that could simulate the movement of the planets or the descent of an angel from the heavens, operated by systems of pulleys and counterweights hidden behind the scenery. He organized festivals and tournaments, designing the visual language of occasions that might be attended by hundreds or thousands of people. He also played music, and played it beautifully. He had brought with him from Florence a lyre made of silver, shaped in the form of a horse's skull, a characteristic piece of Leonardo whimsy, functional and fantastic at the same time. He played and sang at the Sforza court and was apparently so accomplished that he was initially known there primarily as a musician rather than as a painter or engineer. The multi-dimensionality of his gifts was, in Milan as it had been in Florence, simultaneously his greatest strength and a source of constant distraction from any single project. It was in Milan that Leonardo began to inhabit the full range of his curiosity in a way that Florence, with its more specifically artistic culture, had not quite permitted. He began, in earnest, to fill his notebooks. The notebooks, we will spend more time with them later because they deserve a chapter of their own, were not diaries exactly, and not sketchbooks in the conventional sense. They were something stranger and more personal. Working documents in which the boundary between observation and imagination, between the recording of what existed and the designing of what might exist, was almost entirely dissolved.
On a single page, you might find a study of the way water eddies around a submerged obstacle, followed by a sketch for a machine for lifting heavy weights, followed by a note about the best way to represent the texture of an old man's beard in paint, followed by what appears to be the beginning of a fable about a stone and a tree abandoned after 3 sentences. The connections between these things are not always visible, but they were all unmistakably products of the same mind, a mind that experienced the world as a single continuous field of interrelated phenomena, in which the behavior of water and the growth of a beard and the mechanics of a pulley were all different manifestations of the same underlying laws. He began in Milan to think seriously about anatomy. He had always been interested in the human body as a subject for painting, the way light fell on skin, the way muscles moved beneath the surface, the way the proportions of the body related to one another according to rules that could be discovered and codified. But in Milan, this interest began to deepen into something more systematic. He started to attend dissections, events that were, in this period, more common than we might imagine, carried out at hospitals and universities as part of medical education. He began to make drawings of what he saw, the internal organs, the structure of bones, the pathways of nerves and blood vessels. He was not, at this stage, a full anatomist in the scientific sense, but he was beginning to move in that direction with the same steady, irresistible momentum that characterized all his deepest intellectual passions.
He thought about water. He had always been fascinated by water, by its movement, its patterns, its capacity to carve landscapes and carry ships and sustain life. In Milan, surrounded by the network of canals that the Sforza had been developing for decades, he turned this fascination into a series of practical and theoretical investigations. He designed improvements to the canal system. He studied the behavior of water in channels of different shapes and gradients. He filled pages of his notebooks with drawings of waves and currents and whirlpools, trying to find the underlying geometry of motion. He thought about flight. The kite of his childhood memory was still there, somewhere in the back of his mind, and in Milan it began to grow into something more systematic. He watched birds, watched them with the same patient, exhaustive attention he brought to everything, and began to sketch what he observed. The angle of a wing on a rising thermal, the way a tail adjusted to correct a drift in the wind, the precise mechanics of how a bird managed to stay aloft without, apparently, doing very much at all. From observation, he moved to theory, and from theory toward design. His notebooks from the Milanese period contain some of the earliest serious attempts in human history to engineer a machine capable of human flight. None of these investigations produced immediate practical results. That was not quite the point. The point was the understanding, the slow, accumulating, endlessly detailed understanding of how the world worked. Leonardo was building, in these years, a private encyclopedia of natural phenomena that had no precedent and no parallel anywhere in the world at that time. But there were also paintings, and the paintings of the first Milanese period include some of the most quietly revolutionary works in the history of Western art. The first and most important of these is the painting known as the Virgin of the Rocks, or more precisely, the first version of that painting, since Leonardo would eventually produce 2 versions, a story with its own complications. The painting was commissioned in 1483, very shortly after Leonardo's arrival in Milan, by the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception, a religious brotherhood that wanted an altarpiece for their chapel in the Church of San Francisco Grande. The subject, as specified in the contract, was relatively conventional: the Virgin Mary with the infant Jesus, the infant John the Baptist, and an angel set within a landscape. What Leonardo produced from these modest ingredients was something that left, and continues to leave, viewers slightly breathless. The 4 figures are arranged in a rocky, cave-like setting, surrounded by the strange geological formations of an imaginary landscape that seems simultaneously ancient and dreamlike. Water gleams in the background. Exotic plants grow with botanical specificity from the crevices of the rocks. The light, and this is where Leonardo's genius is most fully on display, the light does not come from any identifiable source.
It seems to emanate from within the painting itself, pooling on the faces and hands of the figures with an intimacy that makes the scene feel less like a religious tableau and more like a private moment accidentally witnessed. The angel, similar in spirit to the angel in Verrocchio's baptism, but more fully realized, more completely alive, turns to look directly out of the painting at the viewer, one finger pointing toward the infant John, a gesture that draws the eye into the composition and then holds it there, circling slowly through the tender geometries of the group. Mary's hand curves over the infant Jesus in a gesture of protection so natural, so ungrand, that it seems drawn from life rather than from theology.
It is a painting that rewards very long looking, and it is a painting that announces definitively and without equivocation the arrival of something new in European art. Leonardo was also given, during these years, the task of creating a monument that Ludovico had long dreamed of, an enormous bronze equestrian statue of his father, Francesco Sforza, the founder of the dynasty. The statue was to be the largest bronze horse ever cast, a monument on a scale that would announce to the world the grandeur and permanence of the Sforza name. Leonardo threw himself into the project with characteristic intensity. He studied horses, living horses brought to the stables of the Sforza court, with the same methodical passion he brought to everything. He made hundreds of drawings. He worked through the engineering problems of casting a bronze figure of such unprecedented size, developing new techniques and new approaches to the challenges involved. He built, eventually, a full-scale clay model of the horse, 24 feet high, a thing of extraordinary beauty that was exhibited publicly in Milan and greeted with amazement and admiration by everyone who saw it. And then, in a pattern that was becoming familiar, it was not finished. The bronze that had been set aside for the casting was diverted in 1494 to make cannon for the defense of Milan against the approaching French army. The clay model stood in its courtyard, magnificent and vulnerable, for a few more years, and then the French soldiers used it for target practice, and it was destroyed. The horse of Francesco Sforza never existed in bronze. It exists only in drawings, hundreds of extraordinary drawings, and in the accounts of those who saw the clay model and understood that they were looking at something that had no equal in the world. This, too, was a kind of Leonardo signature. The ambition fully realized in the imagination, partially realized in the world, and then interrupted by circumstances beyond his control. The tension between what he could conceive and what he could complete was not simply a personal failing. It was a structural feature of a mind operating at a scale that the practical conditions of the world could rarely fully accommodate. By the early 1490s, Leonardo was at the height of his powers in Milan, celebrated, productive, surrounded by students and assistants, engaged in projects that ranged from the hydraulic engineering of the Lombardy Canal system to the design of an ideal city, to the investigation of the proportions of the human body. He was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable figures in Europe. And he was about to begin the work for which, more than any other, the world would remember him. On the wall of a refectory in a Dominican convent just southwest of Milan city center, a blank surface was waiting. Leonardo picked up his brush.
There is a refectory, a dining hall, attached to the church of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. It is a long, rectangular room, modest in its proportions, the kind of space that was designed for practical use rather than for grandeur. A place where monks ate their meals in silence, listening to a reader at a lectern recite passages from Scripture or the lives of the saints. The walls are plain. The ceiling is vaulted. The light comes in through windows on the south side, falling across the room in the particular way that northern Italian light falls in the late afternoon. Warm, slightly golden, slightly melancholy. On the north wall of this room, covering a surface approximately 9 meters wide and 4.5 meters tall, is the painting that most people, when asked to name the most famous work of art in the world after the Mona Lisa, will name: The Last Supper. And it began, as so many of Leonardo's greatest undertakings began, with a problem. Ludovico Sforza had commissioned the painting sometime around 1495. The subject was specified by tradition and by the location. A refectory wall, by long convention, was the appropriate place for a depiction of the Last Supper, the final meal that Jesus shared with his 12 apostles before his arrest and crucifixion. The monks who ate in this room would look up from their food and see, on the wall before them, an image of the most sacred meal in Christian history. The parallel was intended to be felt. Their own daily nourishment was a faint echo of that original, redemptive gathering. Leonardo had seen Last Suppers before. Every serious painter of his generation had. It was one of the most frequently depicted subjects in Italian religious art, and the iconographic conventions were well established. Jesus at the center of a long table, the apostles arranged to either side, Judas often isolated or identifiable by some visual marker, the moment of the blessing of the bread and wine rendered with solemnity and hierarchical clarity. Leonardo looked at these conventions and, with the quiet confidence that characterized all his most revolutionary acts, set them aside. His problem, the problem he set himself, the problem that would occupy him for the better part of 3 years, was not how to depict the Last Supper. It was how to depict a specific, charged, psychologically complex moment within the Last Supper. And that moment was this: the instant immediately after Jesus has said to his 12 companions the words recorded in the Gospel of John, "One of you will betray me." The silence that follows those words, the shock, the denial, the guilt, the confusion, the love, all of it simultaneously on 13 faces arranged along a single wall. This was the problem, and it was, in its ambition, almost impossibly difficult. He prepared obsessively. His notebooks from this period are full of studies of faces and hands, the raw material of expression and gesture that he would need to render 13 distinct human responses to a single moment of devastating revelation. He wandered the streets of Milan looking for faces that could serve as models. The particular set of a jaw that suggested indignation, the quality of a gaze that communicated anguish, the precise angle of a hand reaching across a table that could convey, without words, the whole interior drama of a man confronting his own capacity for betrayal.
There is a story, probably true in its essentials if not in every detail, that the prior of Santa Maria delle Grazie complained to Ludovico Sforza about Leonardo's working habits. The painter, the prior reported, would sometimes arrive in the morning, make a single brush stroke, and then stand in front of the wall for the rest of the day, doing nothing, simply looking. On other days, he would not come at all. And then, without warning, he would arrive and work for hours without pause, barely stopping to eat or drink. Leonardo, when Ludovico relayed this complaint, is said to have explained his method with characteristic patience and precision. He was, he said, working even when he appeared to be doing nothing. The hardest part of painting was not the application of paint, but the formation in the mind of the thing to be painted. A painter who rushes to the wall before the image is fully formed in his imagination will produce a painting that reflects his haste. A painter who waits until the image is complete, truly complete, every face, every hand, every fold of cloth, every reflection of light on a wine cup, can then apply it to the surface with the speed and confidence of a man writing out a letter he has already composed in his head. He also had a specific problem with the figure of Judas, which was taking him longer than any other. He could not find a face that satisfied him, a face that could carry the full weight of what Judas represented, the betrayal of love, the surrender to greed, the terrible ordinariness of evil, without tipping over into simple villainy, without reducing one of the most complex figures in all of Scripture to a cartoon. Leonardo is said to have told Ludovico that if he could not eventually find a suitable model for Judas among the living, he would use the prior's face. The prior, apparently, was not amused. The technical approach Leonardo chose for the painting would prove to be both its greatest strength and, in time, the source of its greatest tragedy. Traditional fresco technique, the method used for most large-scale wall paintings of the period, including Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, involved applying pigment directly to wet plaster. The paint bonded chemically with the plaster as it dried, becoming literally part of the wall. The result was extraordinarily durable. A true fresco, properly executed, could last for centuries with minimal deterioration. But true fresco demanded speed. The painter had to work section by section, applying only as much plaster as could be painted in a single session before it dried, typically a few hours. There was no time for the kind of extended looking, the patient revision, the slow accumulation of glazes and refinements that Leonardo's method required. True fresco was, at its core, a technique for decisive men. Leonardo was many things, but decisive in the moment of execution was not among them. And so he chose a different approach. He prepared the wall with a layer of lead white and other preparatory materials, and painted on this dry surface using a combination of tempera and oil-based paints. This gave him the flexibility he needed, the ability to work slowly, to revise, to build up the surface in layers, to achieve the subtle gradations of tone and the sfumato softness that were the hallmarks of his style. It worked in the sense that the painting he produced was everything he had envisioned. It did not work in the sense that the paint, lacking the chemical bond of true fresco, began to deteriorate within decades of its completion. By the time Vasari saw it in the mid-16th century, less than 50 years after Leonardo finished it, it was already in poor condition, the surface flaking and fading, the faces losing their definition. Later centuries brought floods and humidity, and during the Second World War, a bomb that destroyed the refectory roof and left the painting exposed to the elements for years.
What we see today is, in one sense, a ruin, and in another sense, a miracle of survival. But let us go back to the painting as it was, or as it was meant to be. Let us stand in that refectory in the last years of the 15th century, when the paint was still fresh and the colors were still true, and look at what Leonardo had made. The room in the painting is a continuation of the real room. Leonardo painted the architectural space of the Last Supper so that it appeared, in perspective, to be an extension of the refectory itself, as though the wall had simply dissolved and the monks eating their soup were sitting a few feet away from Jesus and his apostles. The tablecloth, the dishes, the placement of the bread and the wine, all of it was rendered with a specificity that made the scene feel not like a vision, but like a memory. And then the figures. Jesus is at the center, his face calm amid the storm he has just created with his words. His eyes are lowered. His hands are open on the table before him, not grasping, not pointing, simply open. Around him, in 4 groups of 3, the apostles react. To his right, the young John, traditionally the youngest and most beloved of the disciples, leans slightly away, his face soft with a sorrow that has not yet fully formed. Next to John, leaning in from the other side with the coiled tension of a man about to spring to his master's defense, is Peter, a knife in his hand. And between them, separated by that knife, slightly pushed back from the table by Peter's forward movement, is Judas, dark-faced, his hand already reaching instinctively toward the purse that hangs at his side, his body language telling the whole story of guilt before his face has time to compose itself. This was Leonardo's solution to the problem of Judas. Not to separate him from the group, not to mark him with a halo of darkness or a pointed finger of accusation, but to embed him in the natural chaos of the moment, to show him reacting as all the others are reacting, and to let his reaction damn him. It is a solution of extraordinary psychological sophistication. To the left of Jesus, James the elder throws his arms wide in a gesture of disbelief so large it seems to fill the air around him.
Thomas raises a finger, the famous finger, which will appear again in another context later in the story, as though making a logical point in the middle of a crisis. Philip presses his hands to his chest, asking without words, "Is it me? Could it be me?" Every group, every gesture, every face is part of a composition so carefully orchestrated that it functions simultaneously as a naturalistic depiction of a human moment and as a formal structure of almost mathematical elegance. The sight lines lead the eye towards Jesus and away from him and back again. The emotional temperature rises and falls across the table like a wave. It is theater and theology and psychology and geometry all at once, all held together by the calm at the center.
The painting was received from the moment it was unveiled as something without precedent. Visitors came from across Italy and beyond to stand in that refectory and look at it. Writers struggled to find language adequate to what they were seeing. The mathematician Luca Pacioli, who was a friend of Leonardo's during these years, described the painting in terms that suggest he found it not merely beautiful, but philosophically significant, a visual proof of something about the nature of human experience that could not be arrived at by any other means. Its influence on subsequent art was immediate and enormous. For the next 2 centuries, nearly every painter who attempted the subject of the Last Supper worked in the shadow of what Leonardo had done on that wall, sometimes consciously imitating it, sometimes consciously resisting it, but never able to ignore it. It had simply redefined what the subject meant and what painting could do. And it endured, imperfectly, brokenly, but stubbornly, through 5 centuries of humidity and neglect and war and misguided restoration attempts, through the hands of people who tried to improve it, and the hands of people who tried to copy it, and the hands of enemies who tried to destroy it. It endured because the idea it contained was too powerful to be entirely killed by the deterioration of the surface that carried it. Today, if you visit Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, and you must book your visit months in advance because only a small number of people are admitted at a time in carefully controlled conditions of temperature and humidity, you enter the refectory through a series of antechambers designed to stabilize the air. You are given 15 minutes. 15 minutes to stand in front of what remains of the thing Leonardo spent 3 years creating. Most people in those 15 minutes are very quiet. There is something in the painting that silences people, something in the calm at its center, in the open hands, in the way the light falls on the tablecloth and the faces, something that reaches across 500 years and the accumulated damage of all that time and still somehow arrives. Leonardo finished The Last Supper in approximately 1498. He was 46 years old. He had been in Milan for 16 years, and the world he had inhabited there, the world of Ludovico Sforza's court, of festivals and commissions and the slow filling of his notebooks, was about to come to a sudden and violent end. The French were coming, and nothing in Milan would ever be quite the same again. Imagine for a moment that you could open a window directly into another person's mind. Not the polished public version of that mind, not the finished paintings or the completed sculptures or the carefully composed letters, but the raw, unedited, continuously running inner life, the half-formed thoughts and sudden connections, the questions that arise at 3 in the morning and refuse to be dismissed, the sketches made in the margins of other sketches, the observations jotted down in the street, in the middle of a conversation, at the edge of sleep. That window exists. It has existed for 500 years, waiting in libraries and private collections across Europe, slowly being gathered and cataloged and studied and wondered at. It is Leonardo's notebooks.
He carried them everywhere, small enough to hang from his belt. He is said to have kept a notebook attached to his clothing at all times so that he could record anything that caught his attention at the moment it caught his attention. They accumulated over the decades into one of the most extraordinary archives in human history. Today, approximately 5,000 pages of Leonardo's notebook materials survive. Scholars believe this represents perhaps 1/3 of what he actually produced. The rest has been lost, destroyed, scattered, stolen, mislaid in the chaos of the centuries since his death. 5,000 pages, and they cover, with an appetite that seems almost impossible for a single human life to have sustained, virtually every field of human inquiry that existed in Leonardo's time, and several that did not yet have names. He wrote from right to left in the mirror script that his left hand found natural, in an Italian that was personal and sometimes idiosyncratic, moving between precise technical description and sudden lyrical flights with the ease of a mind that did not experience the boundary between science and poetry as a boundary at all. To read his notebooks, even in translation, even at the remove of 5 centuries, is to feel, more than anywhere else in the historical record, the actual texture of his thinking, the speed of it, the associative leaps, the way one observation opens onto 3 more questions, each of which opens onto 3 more, until the page is dense with the branching structure of a mind that cannot stop. Let us move through some of what those pages contain, not systematically. Systematic was never quite Leonardo's mode, but in the way he himself might have moved through them, following the thread of curiosity wherever it leads. Anatomy first, because it was perhaps the deepest and most sustained of all his scientific passions. Leonardo's interest in the human body had begun, as we have seen, in the early years of his painting career, as a painter's interest, rooted in the practical need to render the body accurately and convincingly on a flat surface. But in Milan, and increasingly in the years that followed, it grew into something far larger. He began to attend dissections with the systematic intention of a researcher rather than the occasional curiosity of an artist. He worked at times with Marcantonio della Torre, the young professor of anatomy at the University of Pavia, and together they planned what might have been the first truly comprehensive illustrated anatomical atlas in history, a collaboration cut short by della Torre's death from plague at the age of 30.
But Leonardo continued alone. By the end of his life, he had conducted or participated in the dissection of approximately 30 human bodies, men and women, young and old, some who had died of illness, some of old age, at least one 100-year-old man whose death Leonardo witnessed in a hospital in Florence, and whose body he examined immediately afterward, drawing what he found with the steady hand and clear eye of a man for whom wonder and precision were the same thing. What he found and what he drew was extraordinary. His anatomical illustrations were not merely accurate, they were conceptually revolutionary. He invented, or independently arrived at, techniques of cross-sectional illustration, showing a limb or an organ cut through at different angles, that would not become standard in medical illustration for another 2 centuries. He drew the heart with a precision that led him to understand, at least partially, the circulatory function of its valves, a century before William Harvey formally described the circulation of the blood. He drew the fetus in the womb. He drew the optic nerves. He drew the vertebral column from multiple angles, rendering its complex curvature with a 3-dimensional clarity that no anatomist before him had achieved. He was also the first person in history to make an accurate cast of the ventricles of the brain, injecting hot wax into the cavities to reveal their shape, a technique so modern in its conception that it seems to belong to a different century entirely. And running through all of these investigations was the idea that would come to define his understanding of the human body, the body as machine. A magnificent, divinely engineered machine, certainly. Leonardo never lost his sense of the body's beauty or his reverence for the intelligence he believed was embedded in its design, but a machine nonetheless, one whose workings could be understood by careful observation, measured, described, and eventually replicated. The same laws that governed the flow of water through a river governed the flow of blood through the heart. The same mechanical principles that explained the movement of a lever explained the movement of a limb. Nature, for Leonardo, did not distinguish between the animate and the inanimate. It simply applied the same rules, with endless variation, to everything. Water was the other great obsession. Leonardo's relationship with water was almost philosophical in its depth and consistency. He returned to it again and again throughout his life, in different contexts and for different reasons, but always with the same quality of absorbed, patient attention, as though water were a text he was slowly learning to read, one that revealed new meanings every time he came back to it. He studied the movement of water in rivers and canals, the way it behaved when it encountered an obstacle, the patterns of turbulence and eddy and whirlpool that formed behind a submerged stone or at the junction of two currents. His notebook drawings of water in motion are among the most beautiful things he ever made, not because they are decorative, though they are, but because they capture something true about the nature of flowing water that is difficult to express in any other medium. The curling, spiraling, infinitely complex patterns of a disturbed current rendered in ink on a small page with a line that seems to move as you look at it. He was trying to find the underlying geometry of motion. He believed, correctly as it turned out, though the mathematics to prove it would not exist for another 2 centuries, that the patterns of water flow were not random, but governed by precise laws that could be discovered and described. He filled pages with attempts to articulate those laws, sometimes in words, sometimes in diagrams, sometimes in both at once, the words and images winding around each other on the page like the currents he was describing. He also designed for water, canal systems and irrigation networks, drainage schemes and harbor improvements, devices for raising water from low ground to high ground, machines for measuring the flow of rivers. He proposed at various points in his career schemes of such ambition that they seem almost fantastical. The diversion of the Arno River to give Florence direct access to the sea, the draining of the Pontine marshes south of Rome, the construction of a canal connecting Milan to Lake Como with a system of locks that would allow boats to navigate the change in elevation. Some of these schemes were presented to actual patrons and seriously considered. None were built in Leonardo's lifetime. But the ideas were real, and some of them, particularly his work on canal locks, influenced the engineers who came after him in ways that are difficult to trace precisely but impossible to dismiss. Then there is the sky. From the childhood memory of the kite at his cradle to the engineering studies of his middle years, the problem of flight never left Leonardo's mind. And in his notebooks, it becomes one of the most sustained and systematic of all his investigations. He began, characteristically, with observation. He watched birds, not casually, but with the methodical attention of a scientist conducting an experiment. He noted the angle of a wing at different moments in the stroke cycle. He measured or estimated the relationship between a bird's body weight and its wingspan. He observed the way different species used different strategies, the sustained flapping of the pigeon, the soaring efficiency of the eagle, the extraordinary hovering precision of the kestrel, which could hang motionless in the air above a field while the wind blew at 30 miles an hour. From observation, he moved to mechanism. If a bird could fly, it was because its wings generated lift and thrust through their shape and their movement. If wings generated lift, it was because of a specific relationship between the curved upper surface and the flatter lower surface, a relationship that forced the air moving over the top to travel faster than the air moving underneath, creating a difference in pressure that pushed the wing upward. Leonardo did not have the mathematical tools to describe this precisely, but
he grasped the principle intuitively and empirically from watching birds for long enough. And from mechanism, he moved to design. His notebooks contained dozens of sketches of flying machines, devices intended to carry a human being through the air by replicating mechanically the action of a bird's wings. Some of these are ornithopters, machines in which the pilot's arm and leg movements are translated through a system of levers and cables and pulleys into the flapping of large artificial wings. Others are more like hang gliders, fixed-wing devices that would use the pilot's body movement to control direction while relying on the wind for lift. One design, smaller and more contained, bears a striking resemblance to what we would today call a helicopter, a helical screw of canvas and wire that Leonardo believed would, if rotated fast enough, bore into the air like a corkscrew and rise. None of these machines were ever built and tested in Leonardo's lifetime, or if they were, no record of the tests survives. The materials available to him were not adequate to the task. The wood and canvas and rope of the 15th century were simply too heavy relative to their strength to achieve the power-to-weight ratio that flight required. The first successful human flight in a heavier-than-air machine would not occur until 1903, when the Wright brothers lifted off from a beach in North Carolina in a machine made of materials and powered by an engine that did not exist in Leonardo's world.
But the thinking, the patient, systematic, empirically grounded thinking about the problem of flight was 400 years ahead of its time. He thought about warfare too, though his relationship with violence was complicated and, in some ways, contradictory. Leonardo, by all accounts, was a gentle man. He was, famously, a vegetarian, unusual enough in his time to be remarked upon, and is said to have bought caged birds in the market simply in order to release them. He wrote about war with a revulsion that seems genuine, calling it a bestial madness, a disease of the human race. And yet, his notebooks are full of weapons, cannon of extraordinary destructive power, multi-barreled guns that could fire repeatedly without reloading, a giant crossbow mounted on wheels, a scythe chariot designed to cut down infantry, an armored vehicle, a covered shell of wood and metal mounted on wheels capable of carrying men and weapons across a battlefield, that is recognizably the ancestor of the modern tank. The contradiction is real, and Leonardo was aware of it. He occasionally noted in the margins of his weapons designs that he had chosen not to reveal certain of his most destructive ideas, a kind of private censorship, a line he drew somewhere in his own conscience between the useful and the merely murderous. But he drew the weapons anyway, with the same precision and the same quality of attention he brought to the anatomy of a flower or the behavior of light on water. Perhaps the most honest explanation is simply this: Leonardo could not encounter a problem without wanting to solve it, and the problem of how to make a weapon more effective was, as a pure engineering problem, no different from the problem of how to make a canal lock more efficient. His mind did not always pause to ask whether it should solve a problem before determining whether it could. It is one of the most human things about him. And then there is everything else: the geometry, the optics, the geology, the botany, the notebook pages covered in drawings of plants so precise that botanists today can identify the species without difficulty, the acoustics, the study of light and shadow treated as a branch of mathematics, the theory of perspective extended beyond what any of his predecessors had attempted into a comprehensive account of how the eye perceives three-dimensional space. There are also, scattered through the notebooks, things that are harder to categorize: fables, short, often wry allegories involving animals and plants, written in a style that suggests both classical influence and personal invention; riddles, jokes, lists of books he wanted to read, lists of things he wanted to investigate, lists of questions he could not yet answer. One list, heartbreaking in its ambition, includes the note, "Describe the tongue of the woodpecker." He wanted to know how the tongue of a woodpecker worked. He wanted to know everything. He wanted to know it all before he ran out of time,
and he must have understood at some level that he would not, that there were always more questions than years, that the horizon of knowledge, the closer you approached it, simply moved further away.
This was not a source of despair for Leonardo, or at least it does not read that way in the notebooks. It reads, more often, as a source of energy. The incompleteness of his knowledge was not a failure, it was an invitation. Every unanswered question was a door, and Leonardo, throughout his life, could never pass a closed door without wanting to know what was on the other side.
There are moments in history when the world that a person has carefully built around themselves, the routines, the relationships, the slow accumulation of a working life, simply collapses. Not gradually, not with warning enough to prepare, but suddenly, in the space of weeks or even days, leaving the person standing in the rubble of everything that had seemed permanent and being forced, at whatever age they happened to begin again. For Leonardo, that moment came in the autumn of 1499. He was 47 years old. He had lived in Milan for 17 years. He had painted the Virgin of the Rocks and the Last Supper. He had filled thousands of pages of notebooks. He had designed festivals and hydraulic systems and bronze horses and flying machines. He had built, in the court of Ludovico Sforza, something that resembled, more closely than anything else in his life, a home. And then the French army crossed the Alps, and everything changed. The political situation that led to the French invasion of Milan had been building for years, in the complicated, shifting, perpetually unstable manner of Italian Renaissance politics. Ludovico Sforza had, at various points, actually encouraged French ambitions in Italy as a way of neutralizing other threats, a strategy that, like many of Ludovico's strategies, was clever in conception and catastrophic in execution. King Louis XII of France had a dynastic claim to the Duchy of Milan, and in the summer of 1499 he moved to press it, sending an army southward through the Alpine passes with a speed and efficiency that left the Italian state scrambling. Ludovico's allies evaporated. His troops, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, offered little resistance. In September of 1499, the French entered Milan. Ludovico fled, first to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, and then into a period of desperate scheming that would eventually result in his capture and imprisonment in France, where he would die in 1508, never having recovered his duchy. Leonardo watched all of this with the pragmatic clarity of a man who had always understood that powerful patrons were, at some level, a weather system rather than a foundation, something to be used and appreciated while it lasted, but never quite trusted to be permanent. He had, it appears, seen the deteriorating situation coming, at least to some degree. He had been quietly liquidating assets and moving money to Florence in the months before the French arrived. He was not caught entirely unprepared, but he was still left in the autumn of 1499 without a patron, without a home, and without the institutional support that had sustained his work for nearly 2 decades. At 47, he was beginning again. He left Milan in December of 1499, accompanied by his assistant, Salai, a young man of considerable beauty and questionable reliability who had been part of Leonardo's household since childhood and who would remain with him in a relationship of evident affection and occasional exasperation for the next quarter century, and by his friend and mathematical collaborator, Luca Pacioli. His first stop was Mantua, the small but cultured court of the Gonzaga family, ruled at that time by the Marchioness Isabella d'Este, one of the most formidable and intellectually accomplished women of the Italian Renaissance. Isabella was a passionate collector of art and a determined pursuer of the best artists of her age. She had been trying for years to get Leonardo to paint her portrait, and now, with the painter appearing unexpectedly at her court, she pressed her case with characteristic persistence. Leonardo drew of her a preparatory sketch in red chalk that has survived and that shows in its assured and quietly penetrating quality all the confidence of a mature master. Isabella's face is turned slightly to the right, her profile rendered with the kind of attention that suggests Leonardo was genuinely interested in what he saw, an intelligent, determined face, not conventionally beautiful, but full of character and presence. The drawing exists. The painting inevitably does not, or rather was never made. Leonardo stayed in Mantua for only a few weeks before moving on, leaving Isabella with a promise he would never keep and a drawing that would become, over the following years, the subject of an increasingly frustrated correspondence as she wrote letter after letter to various intermediaries asking whether Leonardo had started on the portrait yet, whether he was likely to start, whether there was any way of persuading him, whether anyone had any influence over the man at all. The answer, consistently, was no. Leonardo could not be persuaded, pressured, or charmed into finishing something his mind had already moved past. Isabella d'Este, who was accustomed to getting what she wanted, never got her portrait. From Mantua, Leonardo moved to Venice, arriving in the early months of 1500 in a city that was as unlike Milan as it was possible to be while remaining in northern Italy. Venice was water. It was the smell of the lagoon and the sound of oars and the particular quality of light that came off the canals in the morning, a reflected, doubled, slightly trembling light that painters had been trying to capture for generations. It was a republic, old and proud and deeply suspicious of outsiders, governed by a merchant oligarchy that had survived centuries of plague and war and political intrigue by being extraordinarily careful about who it trusted. Leonardo was there as a military consultant. The Venetian Senate was alarmed by the advance of the Ottoman Turks through the eastern Mediterranean, and Leonardo, drawing on the engineering knowledge he had been accumulating for decades, proposed several schemes for the defense of the Venetian territories. One involved an underwater diving suit that would allow saboteurs to approach enemy ships undetected. Another proposed a system of movable dams that could be used to flood the approaches to the city and drown an invading army. Neither scheme was adopted. Venice, cautious as always, thanked Leonardo for his ideas and did not implement them. But his time in the city fed his existing obsessions in new ways. The behavior of water in the canals, the tides, the currents, and the interaction between the lagoon and the sea gave him new material for the hydraulic investigations that were always running somewhere in the background of his mind. And the light of Venice, that extraordinary doubled lagoon light, left traces in his subsequent painting that art historians have puzzled over and appreciated ever since. By April of 1500, Leonardo was back in Florence. He had been away for 17 years, and the city had changed. The political landscape had shifted dramatically. The Medici had been expelled in 1994 in the turbulent aftermath of the French invasion of Italy, and Florence had gone through a period of religious and political convulsion under the influence of the fiery Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, who had presided over the famous Bonfire of the Vanities, the public burning of mirrors and fine clothing and works of art and books, before being himself arrested, tortured, and burned in the Piazza della Signoria in 1498. The city was now a republic again, more genuinely so than it had been under the Medici, and it was governed, at least in part, by a man named Piero Soderini, with whom Leonardo would soon have dealings, and advised, informally and brilliantly, by a man named Niccolò Machiavelli. Leonardo's return to Florence caused a sensation. He was, by now, a figure of considerable fame, the painter of The Last Supper, the engineer of Ludovico's court, a man whose reputation had preceded him back to his native city and who was greeted, Vasari tells us, with something approaching reverence. He set up in the convent of Santissima Annunziata, whose monks generously provided him with a workshop, and he began almost immediately to produce preparatory work for a new painting, a cartoon, in the technical sense of a full-scale preparatory drawing, for a picture of the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne. When the cartoon was put on public display, the people of Florence came in such numbers and with such evident emotion that Vasari describes it as a kind of festival. 2 days of continuous pilgrimage to see a drawing, not even a finished painting, made by a man who had been away for 17 years and come back still, undeniably, the greatest living painter in Italy. But Florence, for all its welcome, did not hold him for long, or rather did not hold his full attention. In 1502, Leonardo accepted a position that was, by any normal measure, an extraordinary one. He went to work for Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia was, depending on your perspective, either the most brilliant military commander of his generation or the most ruthlessly amoral figure in an age that had no shortage of competition for that title. The illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, he had carved out a personal dominion in central Italy through a combination of military force, political cunning, and a willingness to eliminate obstacles, human obstacles included, with a directness that made even hardened observers uneasy. He was, by general agreement, the model for Machiavelli's prince, the figure from whom the Florentine secretary and political theorist drew his analysis of power stripped of sentiment. Leonardo served Borgia as a military engineer and surveyor, traveling through the territories of central Italy, the Romagna, the Marche, Umbria, mapping roads and fortifications, assessing the defensive possibilities of towns and valleys, designing improvements to castles and harbors. He worked with characteristic thoroughness, producing maps of such accuracy and detail that they remained useful to military planners for generations. His map of the town of Imola, drawn during this period, is so precisely rendered, so modern in its bird's-eye orthographic projection, that it looks more like a 19th century ordnance survey map than anything else produced in the 15th century. He also, almost certainly, met Machiavelli during this period. The two men were in the same places at overlapping times, both in the service of Florence's interests, watching Borgia's campaigns from different but adjacent positions. What they said to each other, if they spoke at length at all, is not recorded. But the meeting of those two minds, the painter-engineer who believed that the world could be understood through patient observation, and the political theorist who believed that power could be understood through the same method applied to human behavior, is one of the tantalizing what-ifs of Renaissance history. By 1503, Borgia's power was collapsing. His father, the Pope, had died, his own health was failing, and the political architecture that had sustained his ambitions was crumbling. Leonardo, with the instinct for timely departure that had served him well in Milan, left Borgia's service and returned to Florence. He was 51 years old. He had been a nomad for 4 years, moving through the ruins and the possibilities of an Italy convulsed by foreign invasion and political upheaval. He had made maps and surveyed fortifications and drawn flying machines and left a trail of unfinished promises behind him in Mantua and Venice and half a dozen other places. But he had also been watching and thinking and filling his notebooks with the relentless accumulation of a mind that found the turbulence of the world not a distraction from his work, but simply more material, more phenomena to observe, more questions to ask. In Florence, a new painting was waiting. He had been carrying it in some form in his mind for years, perhaps since before he left for Milan the first time. A woman sitting, a landscape behind her, a smile that he had not yet quite managed to paint. He was about to try.
There is a painting in the Louvre Museum in Paris that hangs behind bulletproof glass, in a climate-controlled room protected by barriers that keep visitors at a distance of several meters. Every day, thousands of people file past it, cameras raised, necks craning, the room buzzing with the particular energy of people in the presence of something they have been told all their lives is important. Many of them are surprised by how small it is, 77 centimeters tall, 53 centimeters wide, roughly the size of a large piece of poster paper. Many of them, standing in the crowd, straining to see past the shoulders of the person in front of them, feel a flicker of something that might be disappointment. And then, sometimes, the crowd shifts. The angle changes. The light catches the surface of the paint in a particular way. And something happens, something quiet and difficult to name, and the person who felt that flicker of disappointment finds themselves standing very still, looking at a face that seems, impossibly, to be looking back. This is the Mona Lisa, and it has been doing this to people for more than 500 years. Let us begin with what we actually know, which is less than the legend would suggest and more than enough to be extraordinary. The painting is almost certainly a portrait of Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo.
This identification, long debated, was confirmed, or at least very strongly supported, by the discovery in 2005 of a marginal note in a document at the University of Heidelberg, written in 1503 by a Florentine official named Agostino Vespucci, who noted that Leonardo was at that time working on a portrait of Lisa del Giocondo. The note was written in the margin of a copy of Cicero, and it had sat unread in the university library for 5 centuries before a researcher happened to notice it. Lisa Gherardini was born in Florence in 1479, which means she was in her mid-20s when Leonardo began her portrait. She had married Francesco del Giocondo in 1495 and had borne him several children. The occasion for the portrait may have been the birth of a second son or the completion of a new family home, both events that, in the customs of the time, might prompt a prosperous merchant to commission a portrait of his wife. Francesco del Giocondo was a successful man, a member of the city's commercial middle class, exactly the kind of patron who could afford a painter of Leonardo's stature and who would have understood the social value of such a commission. What is harder to explain is everything that happened afterward. Leonardo began the portrait, as best we can determine, around 1503. He was 51 years old, back in Florence after his years of wandering, and the commission was, on the face of it, a routine one. A merchant's wife, a standard format, the kind of work that a painter of Leonardo's reputation might take on between larger projects, or as a favor to a family connection, or simply because something about the subject interested him. What interested him, clearly, was everything. He worked on the painting for years. Not continuously, his life during this period was crowded with other projects, other commissions, other investigations, but he kept returning to it, kept refining it, kept finding new things to do with the surface and the light and the landscape and the face. When he left Florence for Milan again in 1506, he took the painting with him. When he left Milan for Rome, he took it. When he left Rome for France in 1516, he took it still. He never delivered it to Francesco del Giocondo. He never let it go. This fact, the painter keeping the portrait of a merchant's wife for the last 15 years of his life, carrying it across Italy and eventually across the Alps, is one of the great puzzles of the story, and it has generated theories as elaborate and various as the painting itself. Some have suggested that Leonardo simply loved the painting too much to part with it. Some that he considered it perpetually unfinished, always one more session away from completion. Some that his feelings for Lisa Gherardini herself were deeper than a professional relationship would account for. Some, more recently, that the face in the painting changed over the years as Leonardo worked and reworked it, and that it ended up being less a portrait of a specific woman than a meditation on something more universal, on the nature of beauty, perhaps, or on the relationship between inner life and outward expression. We do not know. We will probably never know. This, too, is part of the painting. What we can do is look at what Leonardo actually made and try to understand, with some precision, why it has the effect it has. The composition is, on the surface, simple. A woman seated in a chair, turned slightly toward the viewer, her hands folded in her lap. Behind her, a landscape, mountains and water and roads that wind through an imaginary terrain that recedes into the far distance with a logic that is simultaneously natural and dreamlike. The figure and the landscape are not quite in the same light, the background slightly cooler and more distant in its atmospheric haze, the figure warmer and more present. This distinction between figure and ground, apparently simple, is actually a very sophisticated piece of visual engineering. The hands. Let us begin with the hands, because they are, after the face, the thing most people carry away. They are folded with a natural ease that suggests a person comfortable in their own body, not posing but simply sitting, and yet the arrangement is not casual. It is the result of a very precise compositional decision. The hands form a base for the figure, a horizontal element that anchors the composition and draws the eye upward toward the face. They are painted with extraordinary attention to the specific anatomy of the knuckles and the tendons, the way the skin pulls slightly across the backs of the fingers. They are, in short, the hands of a real person.
and yet arranged as carefully as any element in any painting Leonardo ever made. The landscape behind the figure is unlike any real landscape in Italy or anywhere. It is a Leonardo landscape, which means it is assembled from observed elements, the quality of Italian light, the forms of alpine rock formations, the behavior of water in rivers and valleys, but arranged according to an inner logic that belongs to the painting rather than to any specific geography. The roads that wind through it lead nowhere, or rather, they lead into the blue atmospheric distance of the far mountains where everything dissolves into light and air. It is a landscape that suggests, without insisting, the passage of time, the deep time of geology, of rivers carving valleys over millennia, of mountains rising and eroding and rising again. And then the face. The face is where the painting's mystery lives, and it is a mystery that Leonardo constructed with extraordinary deliberateness. He used, in painting this face, the technique that has come to be most closely identified with his work, sfumato. The word comes from the Italian for smoke, fumo, and it describes a method of painting in which the boundaries between tones and colors are blurred and softened to the point of imperceptibility, so that the transitions between light and shadow happen not as lines, but as gradations too subtle for the eye to locate precisely. The effect, on a face, is to create the impression of skin that is genuinely three-dimensional, that curves away from the viewer into shadow not because a line says it does, but because the light itself seems to behave differently on one part of the surface than another. It is, when it works, uncannily lifelike. It is also, in the Mona Lisa, applied with a precision and a patience that goes far beyond what Leonardo had done in any earlier work.
The corners of the mouth are where the mystery concentrates. The smile, if it is a smile, exists in a region of the painting where the sfumato is at its most extreme. The shadows at the corners of the lips are just deep enough to suggest an upward curve, but never resolved into an unambiguous expression. Look directly at the mouth, and the smile seems to hover between amusement and composure, between knowing and unknowing, between a woman about to speak and a woman who has decided, after all, to remain silent. Look away, at the hands, at the landscape, and when you return to the face, the expression seems to have changed. This is not an illusion exactly, it is a consequence of the way human vision works. The peripheral vision, which is more sensitive to changes in tone than the central vision, picks up more information from the sfumato's shadows when it is not looking directly at them. Leonardo, the lifelong student of optics, understood this. He painted the smile to behave differently depending on how you looked at it, not as a trick, but as an accurate rendering of how a living face actually works. A face in motion, not fixed, a person present, not posed. There is something else in the painting that is less often discussed, but that repays attention. The sitter's eyes follow the viewer, or appear to. This is a common enough effect in portraiture, a consequence of the way a face painted in three-quarter profile interacts with a viewer who moves laterally across it. But in the Mona Lisa, it is combined with the ambiguity of the expression to create something more disquieting. The figure seems not merely to watch, but to consider, to be engaged in some quiet internal evaluation of the person standing in front of her. There is a quality of intelligence in the gaze, Leonardo's intelligence projected onto the face of a Florentine merchant's wife, that makes the painting feel less like a portrait than like an encounter. Perhaps this is why Leonardo could not let it go. Perhaps in working and reworking that face over 15 years, he was engaged in a kind of dialogue with the figure, with the problem of portraiture, with the limits of what paint on wood could be made to say. Perhaps the painting was, for him, less a finished object than an ongoing question. What is the relationship between a face and a self? What does expression actually express? What lives behind the surface of a human countenance, and how close can paint come to reaching it? He never answered these questions definitively. He never finished asking them. And that unfinishedness, that permanent openness, may be exactly why the painting has never stopped speaking to the people who stand in front of it 500 years after the man who made it put down his brush for the last time.
The Mona Lisa passed, after Leonardo's death, to his assistant and companion Francesco Melzi, and then, through a series of transactions, into the French royal collection. It hung in the Palace of Versailles and then in the Louvre. In 1911, it was stolen, removed from the wall by an Italian handyman who believed it belonged in Italy, and was missing for 2 years before being recovered. The theft, paradoxically, made it more famous than it had ever been. The empty space on the Louvre wall attracted more visitors than the painting had. Today, it is the most visited artwork in the world. Millions of people each year make the pilgrimage to that room in the Louvre, raise their cameras, and try to capture something of what Leonardo made. Most of the photographs are indistinguishable from one another, a small painting behind glass surrounded by the blur of a crowd. The painting itself, behind the glass, remains exactly what it has always been. Patient, present, slightly smiling or not quite smiling depending on where you look. Waiting.
There is a particular quality that belongs to a person who has passed through the middle of their life and come out the other side still curious, still reaching, still finding in the world around them more questions than they have time to answer. It is a quality that becomes rarer as the years accumulate. The weight of habit and disappointment and the sheer fatigue of living tends, for most people, to narrow the field of attention gradually inward toward the familiar and the manageable. The horizon contracts. The questions become smaller. For Leonardo, this did not happen. When he returned to Milan in 1506, at the age of 54, he was entering what would prove to be one of the most scientifically productive periods of his entire life. The wandering years had not diminished him. If anything, they had concentrated something, some quality of attention, some urgency of inquiry that now expressed itself with a focus and a depth that his earlier work, for all its brilliance, had not quite reached. He was older. He was tired sometimes. He was aware, in ways as he had not been in his 30s, of the finite nature of the time available to him, and he responded to that awareness not with resignation, but with acceleration. Milan in 1506 was a very different city from the one he had left 7 years earlier. The French, under Louis XII, had consolidated their hold on the duchy, and the city was now governed by French administrators and garrisoned by French troops. The political atmosphere was different, more militarized, more tense, less given to the elaborate cultural pageantry that had characterized Ludovico's court. But it was still a prosperous city, still a city with wealthy patrons and important institutions, and the kind of concentrated, ambitious cultural life that a painter and thinker of Leonardo's needs required. He came back, initially, at the request of the French governor Charles d'Amboise, who wanted him for various architectural and engineering projects. He was also still working, intermittently, on the Mona Lisa, which he had brought with him. And he was resuming a collaboration that had begun during his previous Milanese period and that would, in the years that followed, produce some of the most remarkable scientific work of the entire Renaissance. His collaborator was a young man named Marcantonio della Torre. Marcantonio was everything that the conventional academic world of the early 16th century produced at its best. Rigorously trained, deeply learned in the classical and Arabic medical traditions, holding a professorship of anatomy at the University of Pavia at the improbably young age of 24. He was brilliant, ambitious, and genuinely open to ideas that came outside the established channels of university learning. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person who could appreciate what Leonardo was doing with the human body, and exactly the kind of person who could push him further. The collaboration worked, it seems, in both directions. Marcantonio brought the formal medical knowledge and the institutional access, the ability to obtain bodies for dissection through the hospital at Pavia, the grounding in the theoretical frameworks within which anatomical knowledge was organized and communicated. Leonardo brought the eye, the hand, the ability to look at what was actually there rather than what the textbooks said should be there, and to render it on paper with a three-dimensional clarity that no medical illustrator before him had achieved.
Together, they planned an anatomical treatise that would have been, had it been completed, the most comprehensive and the most visually sophisticated account of the human body produced in any century up to that point. The text would be Marcantonio's, the illustrations would be Leonardo's. It would cover everything: bones and muscles and organs and nerves and blood vessels, the mechanics of movement and the chemistry of digestion, the development of the fetus and the degeneration of the body in old age. It was never completed. In 1511, at the age of 30, Marcantonio della Torre died, most likely of plague, which moved through the cities of northern Italy with terrible regularity. Leonardo was left alone with the project, with pages of notes and hundreds of drawings, and no collaborator to supply the theoretical framework that would have held it all together. He kept working anyway. The anatomical studies from the years after Marcantonio's death are, if anything, more extraordinary than those from before it, as though the loss of his collaborator had driven Leonardo deeper into the work, further into the body, more insistently toward the questions that remained unanswered. The drawings he produced during these years are among the most astonishing objects in the history of human thought. Consider the studies of the heart. Leonardo dissected hearts, ox hearts, human hearts, with a patience and a thoroughness that went far beyond what any anatomist before him had attempted. He was trying to understand not merely the structure of the organ, but its function, how it actually worked, what it actually did in the living body. He understood, from watching the valves open and close during dissection, that the heart was a pump, that it moved blood through the body in a directed, mechanical way. He understood that the chambers of the heart worked in coordination, that the timing of their contractions was essential to the organ's function. He described the action of the valves with an accuracy that would not be matched in the medical literature for another century. He also built physical models. Unable to observe the heart in motion in a living body, the surgery required did not yet exist. He constructed glass models of the aortic valve and used water seeded with grass seeds to visualize the flow patterns within it. He watched how the seeds moved through the model as the water flowed, tracing the swirling, helical patterns of the current, and from these patterns he deduced how the valve actually opened and closed, not by direct pressure from the blood, as was commonly assumed, but through the fluid dynamics of the vortices that formed in the spaces between the valve's leaflets. This finding was published in a scientific paper in the journal Nature in 2014, based on MRI imaging of actual hearts. It confirmed, with the tools of 21st century medicine, what Leonardo had deduced from water, glass, and grass seeds in the early 16th century. He was thinking, in these years, about light with the same systematic intensity he brought to anatomy. Light had always been central to his painting. The sfumato technique was, at its core, a theory of light as much as a method of applying paint. But now he was approaching it as a physicist approaches a phenomenon, systematically, experimentally, trying to reduce it to principles that could be stated and tested and built upon. He understood that light traveled in straight lines. This was not new. But he went further, investigating the way light behaved at the boundaries between different media, the way it bent when it passed from air into water or glass, the way it scattered when it struck a rough surface rather than a smooth one. He investigated the camera obscura, the device in which light passing through a small hole in a darkened room projects an inverted image of the outside world onto the opposite wall, with a thoroughness and a theoretical depth that no one before him had brought to it, understanding it not merely as a curiosity, but as a model for the functioning of the human eye. The eye, for Leonardo, was the supreme organ, the instrument through which the mind reached out and touched the world. He wrote about it with a reverence that was almost devotional, the eye as the window of the soul, but also as a precision optical instrument whose workings could be understood and described in the same terms as any other instrument. He made detailed drawings of the eye's internal structure. He described the inversion of the retinal image, the fact that the image formed on the back of the eye is upside down, and grappled with the philosophical puzzle this created. If the image on the retina is inverted, why do we see the world the right way up?
This question, which he posed clearly and thought about carefully, was not resolved by science for another 2 centuries. He was thinking about the Earth, too, about geological time, about the evidence he saw in rock strata and fossil beds, that the world was far older than any conventional account suggested, that the mountains had once been seabeds and the seabeds had once been mountains, that the processes of erosion and deposition and uplift that shaped the landscape were processes that operated over timescales so vast they dwarfed human history entirely. He wrote about fossils with particular care, dismissing the conventional explanation that they were objects placed in the rocks by God to test human faith or deposited there by Noah's flood as inadequate to account for what he actually observed. Marine fossils found in mountain rock high above sea level were there, he argued, because the rock had once been below the sea and had been elevated by the same forces of geological movement that were still, slowly and imperceptibly, reshaping the surface of the earth. This was not a fringe view. It had been discussed by ancient writers, but Leonardo's insistence on the primacy of direct observation over scriptural authority and his willingness to follow the evidence wherever it led placed him in this, as in so much else, centuries ahead of the scientific mainstream. And there were paintings. Even amid all of this, there were paintings. The second Milanese period produced, among other works, a picture known as St. John the Baptist, painted probably between 1513 and 1516 and now hanging in the Louvre. It is a late work, and it bears all the marks of Leonardo's late style, the figure emerging from an almost total darkness, the sfumato so extreme that the face and the raised pointing hand seem to materialize out of shadow rather than to be illuminated by light from outside. The expression on John's face is one of the most enigmatic in all of Leonardo's work, a smile that is somehow both serene and unsettling, the pointing finger directed upward towards something the viewer cannot see, the eyes holding a quality of private knowledge that resists any simple interpretation. It is a painting that makes people slightly uncomfortable. It does not offer the warmth of the Virgin of the Rocks or the narrative clarity of the Last Supper. It simply presents a figure emerging from darkness, pointing at something beyond the frame, smiling as though he knows something you do not, which is, perhaps, the most accurate self-portrait Leonardo ever made. By 1513, the French grip on Milan had weakened and the political situation in northern Italy was shifting again. Leonardo left Milan for Rome, following the invitation of a new and powerful patron. He was 61 years old, carrying his notebooks and his unfinished paintings and the vast, still accumulating weight of everything he had observed and thought and wondered about over a lifetime. He was not finished yet, but the last chapter was beginning.
Rome, in the second decade of the 16th century, was a city in the process of reinventing itself on a scale that had not been attempted since the emperors. Pope Julius II, who had died in 1513, had set in motion an ambition so vast it bordered on the megalomaniacal, the complete rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, the most important church in Christendom, from its ancient foundations upward into something that would announce to the world the power and the permanence of the Roman Catholic Church. He had commissioned Bramante to design it. He had commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He had commissioned Raphael to paint the papal apartments. He had turned Rome into the most concentrated site of artistic patronage in the world, and the artists who gathered there were, by any measure, the greatest of their generation. Into this world came Leonardo da Vinci in the autumn of 1513 at the invitation of Giuliano de' Medici, the younger brother of the new Pope Leo X, himself a Medici, himself a man of genuine cultural sophistication who understood the prestige value of having the most famous artist in Italy under his roof. Leonardo was 61 years old. He was, by the standards of the time, an old man, though he wore his age, by all accounts, with the same grace he had always brought to his physical presence. He set up in rooms in the Belvedere, a pavilion in the Vatican Gardens that Giuliano had placed at his disposal, and he began, or appeared to begin, a new phase of his working life. It did not go well.
The difficulty was not, or not primarily, a difficulty of talent or of will. Leonardo's mind was as active as it had ever been. His notebooks from the Roman period are full of the usual restless investigations, the hydraulic schemes and optical studies and anatomical observations that had always been the deep current of his inner life. He was planning, during these years, to drain the Pontine marshes south of Rome, a vast engineering project that had defeated every attempt before him and would continue to defeat every attempt after him until the 20th century. He was designing mirrors, large, curved mirrors that could concentrate sunlight with sufficient intensity to heat water or melt metal, a kind of solar technology that was, like so many of his ideas, centuries ahead of any practical application. His mind was working, but his hands were beginning to struggle.
There is evidence, in the later notebooks, in the accounts of people who saw him during these years, that Leonardo had begun to experience difficulties with his right hand. He was left-handed, and the left hand remained functional, but the fine motor control that had allowed him to apply paint with the extraordinary delicacy his technique required seemed to be diminishing. Some scholars believe he had suffered a minor stroke at some point during his later years, though the evidence is not conclusive. What is clear is that the output of finished paintings from the Roman period is very thin, almost nothing compared to the torrential productivity of his middle years in Milan and Florence. He was also, for the first time in his career, genuinely overshadowed. Michelangelo and Raphael were both in Rome during the years Leonardo was there, and both were at the height of their powers. Michelangelo had completed the Sistine Chapel ceiling in 1512, a work of such overwhelming ambition and such physical and creative achievement that it had shifted the center of gravity of European art almost overnight. Raphael was producing, in the papal apartments just a short walk from Leonardo's rooms in the Belvedere, a series of frescoes that combined the intellectual ambition of the Florentine tradition with a formal grace and a compositional clarity that made them immediately and universally admired. Leonardo and Michelangelo had a history. They had been in Florence at the same time in the early 1500s, both commissioned to produce large battle paintings for the council hall of the Palazzo della Signoria, a commission that was never completed, but that generated in its preparatory stages a rivalry so charged and so publicly visible that the whole city seems to have been aware of it. The two men disliked each other. Michelangelo was contemptuous of Leonardo's habit of leaving things unfinished, and said so in the blunt and frequently wounding way that characterized his dealings with almost everyone. Leonardo, for his part, found Michelangelo's obsessive focus on the human figure, his relative indifference to landscape, to light, to the full range of natural phenomena, a kind of poverty of vision, however magnificently executed. In Rome, they moved in the same world without warmth. Raphael, younger than both, admired Leonardo with a sincerity that expressed itself directly in his work. The figure of the brooding philosopher in his fresco The School of Athens, seated apart from the other figures, his face turned slightly away, is generally believed to be modeled on Leonardo. But the relationship between the two men appears to have been cordial rather than close. Leonardo was, in Rome, a figure from an earlier generation in a city that was defining a new one. He was respected, revered even, but he was not central. The work being done around him was the work of men 20 and 30 years younger, men whose careers were in full flood, while his was entering its long, slow, still luminous evening. He struggled with his patron, too. Giuliano de' Medici was a generous man and a genuine admirer of Leonardo, but he was also a man with expectations, the reasonable expectation, shared by every patron in history, that money provided and accommodation furnished would eventually result in paintings delivered. Leonardo did not deliver paintings. He delivered instead excuses, experiments, and the spectacle of a genius pursuing investigations that had nothing obvious to do with the commissions he had been given. There was a particular incident, recounted in a letter that survives from the period, that captures the frustration of Leonardo's Roman years with painful clarity.
He had been given a commission for a religious painting, the subject is not entirely clear from the surviving accounts, and had set about preparing for it by distilling oils and making varnishes and conducting experiments with new techniques of paint preparation. When Giuliano learned that the painter he was paying had not yet made a mark on the actual canvas because he was too busy perfecting the medium with which he intended to paint it, his response was, reportedly, one of quiet but unmistakable exasperation.
Pope Leo X himself, encountering Leonardo at some point during these years and learning of a similar tendency, is said to have remarked, "This man will never do anything, for he is thinking about the end before he has made a beginning." The remark may be apocryphal, but it has the ring of something that was felt, if not said, by many of the people who commissioned Leonardo over the course of his life, and waited and waited and waited. And yet the Roman years were not empty. They were simply interior in a way that the earlier periods had not been, turned inward, reflective, given over more to the consolidation of what had already been discovered than to the generation of new projects and new commissions. He spent time with his notebooks, organizing, revising, trying to bring some order to the vast accumulation of observations and speculations and half-finished treatises that had been building for 40 years. He wrote or rewrote sections of his work on painting, the material that would eventually be gathered, long after his death, into a volume known as the Treatise on Painting, the closest thing to a finished theoretical work that he left behind. He continued his anatomical studies, though without Marcantonio's institutional support they were more difficult to pursue. He thought, perhaps, about legacy, about what would survive of him and in what form, and whether the notebooks, those thousands of pages of mirror-written inquiry, would ever be read by anyone who could understand what they contained and do something with it. He had no children. He had students and assistants, but none of them had the intellectual range to serve as a true heir to everything he had accumulated. The notebooks sat in their chests and their portfolios, waiting. He was also, in these years, lonely in a way that the earlier periods of his life had not quite prepared him for. Giuliano de' Medici died in 1516, removing his most important patron and one of his few genuine Roman friends. The city that had seemed, on his arrival, like an opportunity, had come to feel, by degrees, like a place where he was a guest who had stayed perhaps a little too long. He was 64 years old. His hands were less reliable than they had been. The great paintings were behind him. The notebooks were full of questions that no one had yet thought to ask. And then, from the north, from France, from the court of a young king who had heard of Leonardo and wanted him, simply wanted him, not for any specific purpose, but for the pleasure of his company and the honor of his presence, came an invitation. Leonardo accepted. He packed his notebooks and his paintings and the long, still accumulating wisdom of a life spent watching the world more carefully than almost anyone who had ever lived. And he left Rome, and he crossed the Alps for the last time, and he went to France. The journey across the Alps in the winter of 1516 was not a young man's journey. Leonardo made it at the age of 64, traveling northward through the mountain passes with a small party that included his two most loyal companions, Francesco Melzi, the young Milanese nobleman who had attached himself to Leonardo's household years earlier and who would prove, in the end, to be the most devoted and the most faithful of all the people who moved through Leonardo's life, and Salai, the maddening, beautiful, light-fingered assistant who had been with him since childhood and who remained, despite everything, despite the thefts and the absences and the general unreliability, someone Leonardo could not quite bring himself to be without. They carried with them Leonardo's notebooks, his drawings, his instruments, and 3 paintings, the Mona Lisa, the St. John the Baptist, and a painting of the Virgin and Child with St. Anne that Leonardo had been working on, in one form or another, for most of his adult life, and that was still, characteristically, not quite finished. The destination was the Loire Valley, the heart of the French court, the long green river bordered by chateaux that Francis I had made the center of his ambitious, energetic, perpetually restless kingdom. Francis was 21 years old. He had been king for less than 2 years. He was tall, physically imposing, genuinely educated, and possessed of the kind of confidence that belongs to young men who have never seriously doubted their own importance, and who happen, in this particular case, to have been more or less right about it. He was in the process of making France into one of the great cultural powers of Europe, and he understood, with the instinct of a natural patron, that the way to do this was to attract the best. He had invited Leonardo to France not with a specific commission in mind, not with a painting to be painted or a building to be designed, but simply to be there, to be present, to be Leonardo da Vinci in France at the French court, available for conversation and consultation and the particular kind of inspiration that comes from being near a mind of genuine greatness. It was, in its way, the most generous invitation Leonardo had ever received, and it was, in its way, exactly what he needed. The house provided for him was called Clos Lucé, a small, elegant manor house of pale stone set in the town of Amboise, a few hundred meters from the royal chateau that rose above the Loire on its limestone bluff. It was close enough to the court to allow easy access. There is said to have been an underground passage connecting Clos Lucé to the chateau, though its exact nature and extent have been debated, and far enough to give Leonardo the quiet and the privacy that his working life required. He arrived in the late autumn of 1516, and he seems to have settled into Clos Lucé with a sense of relief that is almost palpable in the few accounts that survive from these years. The house was comfortable. The staff was attentive, the gardens were pleasant. The Loire Valley, in the particular quality of its light, softer and more diffuse than the sharp Tuscan light of his childhood, slightly silvered, slightly northern, seems to have suited him. He walked in the gardens, he sat by the river, he watched the water. He was given a generous pension by Francis, more than enough to live well, to maintain his small household, to buy the materials he needed for whatever work he chose to pursue. He was not required to produce anything specific. He was not subject to the pressure of a patron's expectations, the drumbeat of commissions and deadlines, and the disappointed letters that had characterized so much of his working life. He was, for the first time since those unhurried childhood years on the hillside above Vinci, simply free to follow his attention wherever it led.
And Francis came to him. Regularly, apparently frequently, the young king would make his way from the chateau to Clos Lucé and spend time with Leonardo, talking, listening, looking at the notebooks, watching the old man's hands move across the pages. The accounts that survive of their conversations are few and fragmentary, transmitted through intermediaries who may have embellished or misremembered. But the consistency with which different sources describe the relationship, the young king sitting at the feet, metaphorically if not literally, of the old painter, listening with genuine attention and evident affection, suggests that something real and warm passed between them. Francis is said to have called Leonardo his father. This may be the courtly hyperbole of a man accustomed to the language of flattery and sentiment, or it may be something more genuine, the expression of a feeling that had grown over months of conversation and proximity into something that neither the formal language of patron and artist nor the conventional language of friendship quite captured. Francis had lost his own father when he was a child. Leonardo had no children. Both men were, in different ways, reaching across a gap of 40 years toward something that resembled family. Leonardo, for his part, left Francis the Mona Lisa and the St. John the Baptist in his will, not to a student, not to a fellow artist, not to any of the institutions that might have claimed them on the basis of historical or religious significance, to the king. The personal nature of the bequest suggests that the relationship was, at least on Leonardo's side, more than professional. But the body was failing now in ways that no amount of royal generosity or Loire Valley air could arrest. The right hand, the hand that had never been his drawing hand, but that had always been a capable and willing collaborator in the practical business of life,
had been weakening for years, and in France it gave out almost entirely. There's a note in the hand of the Aragonese Cardinal Luigi d'Aragona's secretary, Antonio de Beatis, who visited Leonardo at Clou-Lucé in October of 1517, that describes what he found with the careful, slightly clinical attention of a man recording something he considers worth preserving. Leonardo, de Beatis wrote, had suffered a paralysis of the right hand, such that he could no longer paint with the finesse he once had. He could still draw, after a fashion, with the left. He could still think clearly and continuously, and with the old depth, but the physical act of painting, the application of paint to surface with the extraordinarily delicate, patient, layered technique that had made the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper and the Virgin of the Rocks, was, for the right hand, finished. Leonardo showed his visitors the notebooks. He showed them the anatomical drawings. He showed them, de Beatis records, 3 paintings that he said he could no longer bring to completion with the same fineness of touch he once commanded. One of these was certainly the Mona Lisa. Another was almost certainly the St. John the Baptist. He was 65 years old. He had been painting for almost 50 years, and now he could not paint. What did he do in those last months with the time that remained? He worked in the notebooks still. The pages from the final period are different in character from the earlier ones, less driven, less urgent, more given to the long arcs of thought rather than the rapid, darting observations of his middle years. He was thinking about water again, always water, to the end, and specifically about the great deluges that he imagined had shaped the surface of the earth in its deepest past. His late drawings of floods and deluges are among the strangest and most powerful things he ever made. Great spiraling torrents of water, obliterating everything in their path, rendered with a kind of terrible beauty that seems to come from somewhere beyond the merely technical. They are the drawings of a man thinking about endings.
He revised his will. He attended to the practical business of distributing what he had accumulated over a lifetime, the notebooks to Melzi, the paintings to Francis, smaller bequests to Salai and to his servants, money to his half-brothers back in Florence, with whom he had maintained, over the decades, a relationship of intermittent legal dispute and occasional warmth. He arranged for masses to be said for his soul, in the careful, traditional manner of a man of his time, whatever his private beliefs about the nature of the soul and the universe it inhabited. He was tended in his final illness by Melzi, faithful Melzi, who had followed him from Milan to Rome to France, and who would spend the rest of his own long life organizing and protecting the notebooks, guarding them against the world with the devotion of a man who understood, even if no one else fully did yet, what they contained. Leonardo da Vinci died on the 2nd of May, 1519, at Clos-Lucé, in the town of Amboise, in the valley of the Loire. He was 67 years old. The cause of death was most likely a stroke, consistent with the progressive paralysis that had been affecting him for years. He died, by all accounts, peacefully, attended by Melzi and by the servants of his household, in the pale stone house beside the river, with the sound of the Loire somewhere beyond the garden wall, and the spring light of a French May morning coming in through the windows. Francis, according to the account that Vasari repeats, and that may or may not be literally true, was at his bedside when he died, holding him, weeping, lamenting that no man would ever again come into the world who possessed Leonardo's equal in knowledge and virtue. The account is almost certainly embellished, possibly entirely invented, but the king's grief was real. He had lost in Leonardo something that he understood, perhaps better than most of his contemporaries, could not be replaced. The body was buried in the collegiate church of San Florentin in Amboise. The grave was later lost in the upheavals of the French Revolution, when the church was demolished and the remains of its occupants scattered. In the 19th century, bones believed to be Leonardo's were gathered and reinterred in the chapel of Saint-Hubert in the grounds of the Amboise chateau, where they rest today, under a simple stone, a short walk from the house where he died and the river he spent his last years watching. Melzi returned to Milan after Leonardo's death, carrying the notebooks in their chests, carrying the drawings, carrying everything that Leonardo had asked him to take care of. He kept them for the rest of his long life. He lived until 1570, 50 years after Leonardo's death, organizing them, making copies, lending them occasionally to scholars who came to see them, but never publishing them and never allowing them to be dispersed. After Melzi's death, the notebooks began their long journey through the world, scattered, sold, stolen, lost, rediscovered, misattributed, partially transcribed, partially destroyed. Some passed into royal collections, some ended up in private hands, some disappeared entirely. The 13,000 pages that Leonardo is believed to have produced have never been fully reassembled, and perhaps never will be. But enough survived, enough to let us sit 5 centuries later in the light of what he left behind and understand, imperfectly, partially, but genuinely, something of what it was to be inside that mind.
When Leonardo died in the spring of 1519, the world did not immediately understand what it had lost. This is not quite as strange as it sounds. The people who knew him understood, in a general way, that someone extraordinary had passed from the world. Francis I wept. Melzi wrote in a letter to Leonardo's half-brothers in Florence that the death of his master was a grief that he did not believe time would ever entirely heal, that he had lost not merely an employer or a teacher, but something more irreplaceable, a father in every sense that mattered. The letter is one of the most genuinely moving documents of the period, all the more affecting for its restraint, for the way Melzi searches for words adequate to what he is trying to say and finds in the end that there are none. But the full scale of what Leonardo had been, the full dimensions of the mind that had just gone out of the world, would take centuries to become apparent. And the reason for this delay is both simple and, in retrospect, heartbreaking. The notebooks were not published. This is the central fact of Leonardo's posthumous history, and it cannot be overstated. The thousands of pages in which his scientific investigations lived, the anatomy, the hydraulics, the optics, the geology, the mechanics, the aeronautics, remained in private hands, circulating among a small number of scholars and collectors, copied in fragments and described in general terms, but never organized and never printed and distributed in the way that would have been necessary to make their contents part of the general conversation of European science. Melzi, as we have seen, kept them faithfully but privately. After his death, they began to scatter. By the end of the 16th century, they had been divided, sold, stolen, and redistributed across the libraries and private collections of Europe in a way that made systematic study almost impossible. Individual manuscripts surfaced here and there, a collector in Milan, a royal library in Spain, a private archive in England, but the full picture of what Leonardo had done and thought and discovered could not be assembled from the fragments available to any single reader. The scientists who were in the late 16th and 17th centuries laying the foundations of the modern scientific revolution, Galileo, Kepler, Harvey, Descartes, Newton, worked largely without access to Leonardo's notebooks. They arrived, in many cases, at conclusions Leonardo had already reached by routes that did not pass through his work. The circulation of the blood, which Harvey described in 1628, had been understood in its broad outlines by Leonardo more than a century earlier. The wave theory of light, the principles of hydraulics, the geological understanding of deep time, all of these ideas existed fully formed in Leonardo's notebooks, waiting to be found.
They were not found in time to matter for the purposes of scientific history, and so the notebooks became instead a kind of retrospective revelation, a document not of influence but of astonishment, a record of how far ahead of his time a single human mind could travel. The artistic legacy was immediate and enormous, even if it was not always fully attributed. Leonardo's painting technique, the sfumato, the atmospheric perspective, the psychological depth of characterization, the treatment of light as something that emanated from within a figure rather than falling on it from outside, transformed European painting in the decades after his death, transmitted partly through the direct influence of his students and partly through the paintings themselves, which were seen and copied and absorbed by artists across Italy and eventually across the continent.
Raphael, as we have noted, studied Leonardo directly and with evident admiration, and the influence is visible in some of the most celebrated works of the High Renaissance. Raphael's Madonna paintings carry, in their pyramidal compositions and their soft atmospheric quality, the clear imprint of what Leonardo had done. The generations of painters who came after Raphael, the Mannerists and later the Baroque masters, inherited these conventions without always knowing exactly where they had come from, in the way that a river carries water from sources that its downstream tributaries have never seen. The Last Supper alone was sufficient to secure Leonardo's place in the history of Western art. It was copied, referenced, and responded to by virtually every major painter who attempted the subject in the following 2 centuries, and by many who never attempted it, but absorbed its lessons about the dramatic organization of multiple figures in a unified space. It changed what painting could do, not merely in its subject, but in its ambition, in its insistence that paint on a flat surface could carry the full weight of human psychological complexity. The scientific legacy, when it finally became fully visible, was staggering in a different way. Staggering not because it had influenced subsequent science, but because it demonstrated with almost painful clarity how different the history of science might have been if the notebooks had been published. The systematic study of the notebooks began in earnest in the 19th century, when scholars started to gather and transcribe the scattered manuscripts and to understand, for the first time, the full breadth of what Leonardo had investigated. The reaction of the scientists and historians who first worked through the material was, in the accounts that survive, something close to disbelief. Here was the heliocentric principle approached from a direction independent of Copernicus. Here was the circulation of the blood, understood a century before Harvey. Here was a theory of plate tectonics expressed in the language of the 15th century. Here was the wave nature of light, the mathematical description of turbulence, the principle of the conservation of mass in fluid flow. Here, most astonishingly of all, were flying machines that worked, or would have worked if the materials to build them had existed. The Wright brothers, who made the first successful powered flight in 1903, were aware of Leonardo's aeronautical drawings. They had not studied them in detail, and their own designs derived from different principles and different observations, but the basic insight that flight was a problem of engineering, that it could be solved by understanding the mechanics of how a bird's wing generated lift, and that a machine designed on those principles could carry a human being through the air, was Leonardo's insight, arrived at 4 centuries before the first airplane left the ground. What do we make of a mind like this? How do we place it in the story of human thought? The temptation, which many writers have succumbed to, is to make Leonardo into a myth, to round him up into the perfect universal genius, the Renaissance man in capital letters, the figure who somehow contains within himself all of the possibilities of human intelligence expressed at their absolute maximum. This version of Leonardo is satisfying in the way that myths are satisfying. It is clean, it is coherent, it resolves the complexity of an actual human life into a shape that is easy to admire and difficult to argue with.
But the real Leonardo, the man who left things unfinished, who disappointed his patrons, who could not always translate the extraordinary precision of his inner vision into the limited materials of the outer world, is more interesting than the myth. He is more interesting because he is more human, because his greatness existed in permanent tension with his limitations, because the qualities that made him capable of conceiving flying machines and understanding the circulation of the blood were the same qualities that made him incapable of finishing the Adoration of the Magi or delivering a portrait to a patient merchant's wife. The insatiable curiosity that drove him to understand everything was also the quality that prevented him from completing anything, because completion required a kind of renunciation, a willingness to say, "This is finished, this is what I know, this is as far as I can take it," that his mind could never quite manage. Every finished thing was, for Leonardo, a door closing, and he could not bear closed doors. There is a quality in the notebooks that becomes more apparent the longer you spend with them, a quality that is difficult to name precisely, but that feels, reading them across the distance of 5 centuries, like a form of companionship. He was, in those pages, talking to someone, not to any specific reader, not to posterity in the self-conscious way that some writers address the future, but simply talking, following the thread of his thought wherever it led, pausing to draw when words ran out, returning to a question he had asked 20 years earlier with new evidence and new tools, circling back and back and back to the things that mattered most to him: water, light, the body, the sky. The question of how things worked and why they were beautiful, and whether those two questions were, in the end, the same question. Reading the notebooks is, in the best moments, like sitting in a room with Leonardo, like hearing, across 500 years, the sound of a mind that was genuinely, continuously, inexhaustibly alive. He left behind approximately 15 paintings that are universally accepted as his own work. He left behind thousands of pages of notebooks. He left behind a way of looking at the world, patient, precise, wondering, open, that did not found a school or establish a tradition in any formal sense, but that has continued to feel to every generation that has encountered it like a kind of permission. Permission to be curious without limit. Permission to ask questions that have no immediate practical application. Permission to find the ripple of water and the curve of a cheekbone and the mechanics of a bird's wing all worthy of the same quality of attention, because the world, looked at carefully enough, reveals itself to be a single, endlessly intricate, endlessly beautiful thing. This is what Leonardo left behind. Not a completed system, not a finished theory, not a resolved and tidy legacy that can be summarized in a sentence. Just the notebooks and the paintings and the endless, still reverberating invitation to look more carefully, to pay attention, to wonder.